The Whispering Coast. The ancient shores of Crete held secrets that predated the rise of Athens. Mysteries that were whispered about in hushed tones by sailors who claimed the winds themselves carried voices from another time. These weren't the grand tales of Zeus and his thunderbolts or Poseidon's rage against the sea. These were older stories, stranger stories, the kind that made even the bravest warriors pull their cloaks tighter against the Mediterranean breeze. The coast near Knossos possessed a quality that defied explanation, where the boundary between the waking world and the realm of dreams seemed to dissolve with each crashing wave. Fishermen who worked these waters spoke of hearing their names called from the rocks when no one else was present. They described voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, speaking in a dialect so ancient that the words felt more like memories than sounds. Some claimed these whispers predicted storms before the sky showed any warning signs. Others swore the voices guided them to schools of fish they never would have found otherwise. But all agreed on one thing. The coast was aware, conscious in a way that made rational minds uncomfortable. The phenomenon intensified during certain lunar phases, particularly when the moon hung full and low over the palace of Knossos. During these nights, the whispers became almost musical, creating harmonies that no human throat could produce. Villagers who lived closest to the shore learned to recognize patterns in these ethereal songs. Some melodies seemed to bring peaceful sleep and pleasant dreams. Others carried warnings, filling the night with an urgency that kept families awake, barring their doors against some unseen threat that never quite materialized but felt devastatingly real. Scholars from across the Mediterranean traveled to study this strange coastal region. They brought instruments to measure wind patterns, consulted with priests about divine interventions, and interviewed locals who had lived with the phenomenon their entire lives. Yet none could provide a satisfactory explanation. The whispers defied categorization. They weren't simply wind through rock formations or the acoustic properties of coastal caves. They possessed intentionality, responding to the presence of specific individuals in ways that suggested purpose and awareness. One particular stretch of coastline, roughly 300 paces from where the palace walls could be seen against the sky, demonstrated the most intense manifestations. Here, the whispers became almost conversational. Travelers who paused to rest on the smooth stones reported hearing complete sentences, though the language shifted between ancient Minoan dialects and something even older, something that predated human settlement on the island entirely. Linguists who studied recordings of these sounds identified syllables and phonetic patterns that matched no known language family, suggesting either an elaborate hoax or something genuinely anomalous. The whispers seemed particularly drawn to those carrying burdens of guilt or unresolved choices. A merchant who had cheated his partners heard detailed descriptions of his deceptions whispered back to him from the rocks. A mother who had lost a child to illness heard what sounded like her daughter's voice, speaking words of forgiveness that brought her to her knees. These personal revelations suggested the coast somehow accessed the deepest thoughts and memories of those who walked its shores, reflecting back truths they had tried to hide even from themselves. Local tradition held that the whispers originated from the Labyrinth itself, that vast underground structure whose true extent remained unknown despite centuries of exploration. According to this belief, the maze beneath Knossos breathed, inhaling and exhaling through hidden passages that opened onto the coast. The whispers were its breath, carrying fragments of all the secrets ever kept within its twisting corridors. Every lie told, every forbidden love, every act of courage or cowardice that occurred within the labyrinth's walls supposedly became part of this endless exhalation, mixing with the salt air and the cries of seabirds. Some versions of the legend went further, claiming the whispers weren't from the labyrinth itself, but from those who had entered and never returned. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people had ventured into the maze over the centuries. Criminals sentenced to death, volunteers seeking glory, scholars pursuing knowledge, and the simply curious had all disappeared into its darkness. What if they hadn't died, but instead become part of the structure itself, their consciousness absorbed into the stone and earth, their voices merging into the eternal whisper that haunted the coast? This theory gained support from the content of some whispers. People reported hearing specific warnings about dangers within the palace or advice about navigating social situations at court. Information that a disembodied ancient voice shouldn't possess, but that a recently absorbed consciousness might know. A young servant girl heard whispers that warned her about a conspiracy against her master. Details that proved accurate and saved lives. How could wind and stone know such things unless something genuinely conscious was trying to communicate? The priests of Knossos had their own interpretation. They taught that the goddess herself spoke through the coast, that the whispers were divine communications from the deity who protected the island and its people. This goddess, older than the Olympians who would later dominate Greek religion, supposedly dwelled in the earth beneath the palace. The labyrinth was her temple, its confusing passages a test of worthiness for those seeking her wisdom. The whispers were her way of guiding the worthy and warning away those who would profane her sacred spaces. Archaeological evidence supported the presence of ancient goddess worship on Crete. Countless figurines depicting female deities had been found throughout the palace and surrounding areas. Frescoes showed priestesses in elaborate rituals, some wearing crowns that resembled architectural elements of the labyrinth itself. The connection between the divine feminine, the maze, and the mysterious coastal phenomena formed a coherent religious framework that satisfied spiritual explanations even as it frustrated scientific ones. Yet the whispers predated even these ancient religious practices. The oldest settlements on Crete, villages that existed before the Great Palace was built, already spoke of the voices from the shore. Their pottery showed crude depictions of people kneeling before waves, hands pressed to their ears as if straining to hear something important. These prehistoric people lacked the sophisticated theology that would later develop, but they clearly recognized something special about this particular coastline long before the labyrinth was ever conceived. Geologists examining the region discovered unusual rock formations beneath the coastal shelf. Limestone caverns of unusual regularity extended far inland, creating natural acoustic chambers that might amplify and distort ordinary sounds into something seemingly supernatural. Water flowing through these formations could create tones and harmonies that mimicked human speech under the right conditions. This explanation satisfied the rational-minded, though it failed to account for the personal nature of many whisper encounters or their apparent foreknowledge of events. The true nature of the whispering coast might lie somewhere between the purely physical and the genuinely supernatural. Perhaps the unusual geology did create amplified sounds, but over centuries of human habitation, belief, and ritual, something else took root: collective consciousness, divine attention, or some form of environmental awareness that science hadn't yet developed frameworks to understand could have layered itself over the natural acoustic phenomena, creating something hybrid and strange. Travelers who visited the coast with open minds and patient ears reported transformative experiences. The whispers seemed to adjust to each listener, speaking in tones and cadences that resonated with individual psyches. Some heard encouragement during difficult times. Others received warnings that saved them from danger. A few claimed the whispers taught them secrets of craft and skill, knowledge that shouldn't have been transmissible through sound alone but somehow was. The phenomenon created a strange economy around Knossos. People seeking guidance made pilgrimages to the Whispering Coast, bringing offerings of wine, oil, and crafted goods to leave among the rocks. Local guides specialized in leading visitors to spots where the whispers were strongest, though they cautioned that the voices chose whom to address. Spending hours on the coast guaranteed nothing. The whispers came when they wished, to whom they wished, delivering messages that might be profound wisdom or incomprehensible fragments of sound. Night visits to the coast required particular courage. Darkness intensified every aspect of the experience. Without visual distractions, the whispers seemed to surround visitors completely, coming from the sky, the sea, and the earth simultaneously. Some claim to see lights moving along the shore during these night vigils, glowing orbs that danced above the water before vanishing into the rocks. Whether these lights were related to the whispers, separate phenomena, or simply phosphorescence in the water remained debated. The emotional impact of the whispers varied dramatically. Some listeners emerged from the coast feeling blessed, their spirits lifted by what they had heard. Others left disturbed, having been confronted with uncomfortable truths about themselves or warnings about futures they didn't want to face. A few became obsessed, returning night after night to hear the voices again, neglecting work and family in their fixation. The coast gave what it chose to give, and not all gifts were welcome. Children seemed particularly receptive to the whispers, hearing voices that adults missed entirely. They spoke of playful tones, whispers that invited them to games and adventures. Parents learned to keep their youngest away from certain stretches of shore after several children claimed the voices wanted them to swim out to sea or explore caves that were too dangerous for small bodies. Whether these were genuinely malevolent whispers or misinterpretations of natural sounds filtered through imaginative young minds was impossible to determine. The palace elite maintained complex relationships with the Whispering Coast. Some rulers consulted it regularly, treating the whispers as oracles that could guide policy and strategy. Others viewed the phenomenon with suspicion, seeing it as a potential threat to their authority. If the coast could reveal secrets and provide guidance, what need did people have for kings and priests? Several attempts were made to restrict access to the shore or even to physically alter the coastline to end the whispers, but these efforts always failed, or were abandoned before completion. Records from the palace archives, fragmentary as they were, contained references to the whispers spanning centuries. They were mentioned in economic documents as a source of tourism and offerings. Religious texts incorporated them into larger mythological frameworks. Military reports noted their use in predicting enemy movements or weather conditions crucial to naval operations. The whispers had become woven into every aspect of Cretan life, so fundamental that imagining the island without them seemed impossible. As Greek civilization evolved and the Great Palace era ended, the Whispering Coast remained. Conquerors came and went, new religions replaced old gods, but the voices in the rocks continued their eternal conversation with those who would listen. Later, Greek travelers wrote about them with the same mixture of wonder and unease that had characterized Minoan accounts centuries earlier. The Roman period brought new interpretations, connecting the whispers to various deities from their own pantheon, but the phenomenon itself remained unchanged. Modern visitors to the ruins of Knossos sometimes report strange experiences on the nearby coast. The whispers haven't vanished despite millennia of change. They speak now to tourists with cameras and archaeologists with ground-penetrating radar, delivering messages in languages that shift and adapt to each new era. Whether one believes these experiences are supernatural communications, acoustic coincidences, or the power of suggestion doesn't ultimately matter. The Whispering Coast continues to do what it has always done, serving as a boundary space where the ordinary rules of reality seem suspended and something older makes itself known. The relationship between the coast and the labyrinth remained the most tantalizing mystery. Were they truly connected, two parts of a larger whole? Did the whispers originate from within the maze, or were they independent phenomena that human storytelling had linked together? The palace builders clearly understood something about this relationship, positioning their great structure precisely where the whispers were strongest, creating an architectural response to a natural or supernatural feature they couldn't fully control but could acknowledge and incorporate. Standing on that ancient shore, feeling the wind carry sounds that might be words, or might be nothing more than air moving through stone, visitors throughout history experienced something fundamental. The whispers reminded them that the world contained mysteries beyond human understanding, that consciousness and communication might exist in forms alien to human experience, and that the past never truly vanishes but continues speaking to those patient enough to listen. The Whispering Coast served as a gateway, a threshold between the world of daily concerns and something vaster, older, and infinitely strange. The stories told about the whispers evolved with each generation, but the core experience remained constant. Something in those rocks and waves reached out to human consciousness, delivering messages that felt both utterly personal and completely alien. Whether divine speech, geological accident, collective unconscious, or something beyond current categories of understanding, the Whispering Coast stood as testament to the enduring power of mystery in human experience. It reminded the ancient world, and reminds us still, that not everything can be explained or controlled, and that sometimes wisdom comes from simply listening to what the earth itself might be trying to say. The moon over Knossos. The moon held special significance for the people of ancient Crete, but nowhere was this relationship more intense than in Knossos, where the palace itself seemed designed to capture and channel lunar light into its deepest chambers. The architects had understood something about the moon's power that went beyond simple timekeeping or agricultural calendars. They built structures that responded to lunar phases, creating spaces where moonlight transformed ordinary stone into something that glowed with otherworldly luminescence during specific nights of the year. The palace's orientation wasn't random. Every major corridor, courtyard, and ceremonial space aligned with the moon's movements across the sky throughout the year. During the full moon of the summer solstice, light would penetrate through carefully positioned windows and doorways, illuminating paths through the structure that remained shadowed during other lunar phases. These light corridors changed with each moon, creating a constantly shifting architecture where the same hallway might lead to entirely different experiences depending on when you walked it. Priests tracked these lunar patterns with obsessive precision. They maintained detailed records of which paths opened under which moons, which chambers received light and which remained dark, which frescoes became visible only when moonlight struck them at particular angles. This knowledge represented real power in a society that believed the gods spoke through celestial movements. Those who could read the moon's messages through the palace's stone and plaster possessed authority that transcended ordinary political hierarchies. The connection between the moon and the labyrinth ran deeper than mere architectural curiosity. According to the most ancient traditions, the maze beneath the palace existed in two states simultaneously. During daylight hours, it followed one configuration, its passages leading to the destinations expected by those who knew its layout. But under moonlight, particularly during full moons, the labyrinth transformed. Passages that had been dead ends suddenly opened onto new chambers. Walls that seemed solid during the day became translucent, revealing previously hidden paths. The maze became something alive, breathing and shifting with the moon's phases. Those who entered the labyrinth during these lunar transformations reported experiences that defied ordinary description. Time behaved strangely, with hours feeling like minutes or minutes stretching into days. Spatial relationships broke down, allowing travelers to see multiple paths simultaneously, each leading to different outcomes. Some emerged claiming they had met themselves, older or younger versions, walking different corridors, making different choices. Others spoke of rooms that couldn't physically fit within the palace's known dimensions. Vast halls and endless staircases existing in impossible spaces. The moon's light itself possessed qualities that normal light lacked. It penetrated deeper, casting shadows that were somehow more illuminating than the light itself. Things hidden in bright daylight became visible under moonlight, while obvious features faded or disappeared entirely. This reversal of normal perception created an environment where intuition and dream logic proved more reliable than rational observation. Navigating by moonlight required abandoning conventional wayfinding and trusting instincts that operated below conscious thought. Specific lunar phases corresponded to different aspects of the labyrinth's nature. The new moon, when no lunar light reached the palace, was considered the most dangerous time to enter the maze. Without even minimal illumination, the labyrinth became absolutely foreign, its passages leading to places that might not connect to the physical world at all. Several stories told of people entering during the new moon and simply vanishing, with no trace ever found despite exhaustive searches. The darkness swallowed them completely, taking them somewhere beyond recovery. The waxing moon brought growth and revelation. As the moon increased toward fullness, the labyrinth expanded, revealing new areas that hadn't existed before. Explorers who mapped the maze during this phase would find their maps obsolete once the moon waned, with previously documented chambers and corridors nowhere to be found. This made comprehensive mapping impossible. But it also meant the labyrinth held infinite possibility. Whatever you sought might be found during the right lunar phase, appearing briefly before vanishing again as the moon changed. Full moon nights were reserved for the most sacred ceremonies. The palace would come alive with activity. Priestesses in elaborate costumes moving through light-filled corridors in complex dances that followed the moon's path across the sky. These rituals weren't just religious observances, but practical applications of lunar knowledge. The priests believed they could communicate with the divine during these ceremonies, asking questions and receiving answers through the patterns moonlight created on specially prepared walls and floors. The responses came in the form of symbols, shadows cast by moonlight that formed recognizable shapes when viewed from precise positions. Interpreting these symbols required years of training, learning to distinguish meaningful patterns from random shadow play. Master interpreters could extract detailed guidance from what appeared to casual observers as nothing more than darkness and light dancing on stone. They claimed the moon goddess herself spoke through these shadows, providing counsel on everything from crop planting to military strategy. But the full moon also brought danger. Whatever power animated the labyrinth reached its peak during these nights, making the maze almost alive with intention and purpose. It would test anyone who entered, presenting challenges tailored to individual weaknesses and fears. Ki Hoi, some people emerged from full moon encounters with the labyrinth transformed, having faced their deepest issues and found resolution. Others came out broken, psyches shattered by confrontations with truths they weren't ready to accept. The moon's light revealed everything, and not everyone could bear that level of exposure. The waning moon brought reflection and release. As lunar light decreased, the labyrinth simplified, its infinite possibilities collapsing back into more manageable configurations. This was when people went to leave offerings, to say goodbye to things they needed to release. The shrinking moon took these sacrifices, both literal offerings and metaphorical burdens, carrying them away as the light faded. By the time the new moon arrived, the slate was clean, ready for the next cycle to begin with the following waxing phase. Astronomical knowledge in Knossos reached levels that seemed impossible for the era. The priest could predict lunar eclipses with perfect accuracy, knew the precise timing of blue moons and other rare phenomena, and understood the complicated relationship between lunar and solar cycles. They used this knowledge to plan important events, timing coronations, declarations of war, and treaty negotiations to coincide with favorable lunar aspects. The moon was their clock, their calendar, and their guide to navigating both physical and spiritual realms. The palace architecture included features specifically designed to mark important lunar events, certain windows aligned so that during the lunar equinoxes, moonlight would strike specific spots within the throne room, illuminating the king's seat with perfect precision. Other alignments marked the extremes of the moon's movements across the sky, events that occurred only once every 18.6 years. The builders had planned for these rare occurrences, creating lasting monuments to cycles that exceeded individual human lifespans. Frescoes throughout the palace depicted lunar scenes with careful attention to phase and position. These weren't simply decorative choices, but encoded information about the moon's movements and their meanings. A painted moon at a certain phase in a particular location within a fresco might indicate the best time for specific activities or warn against others. Reading the palace walls required understanding this lunar language, seeing the images not as static art but as dynamic text that change meaning depending on when you viewed them. The relationship between the moon and water featured prominently in palace design and ritual. Cisterns and basins positioned throughout the structure collected rainwater that was then exposed to moonlight before being used in ceremonies. This moon-charged water supposedly possessed healing and transformative properties. It was used to anoint kings, bless newborns, and treat serious illnesses. The priests maintained that water could store lunar energy, holding the moon's power within liquid that could then be distributed and applied as needed. Gardens within the palace complex featured plants selected for their relationship with lunar cycles. Night-blooming flowers that only opened under moonlight filled certain courtyards, creating spaces of incredible beauty that existed only after dark. The scent of these flowers mixed with the visual spectacle of moonlit architecture, creating multi-sensory experiences that transported participants into altered states of consciousness. Walking through these moon gardens prepared initiates for deeper encounters with the labyrinth's mysteries. The moon's influence extended beyond the palace walls into the surrounding city. Houses were positioned and windows placed to capture moonlight in ways that honored the practices developed at the palace. Common people might not have access to the labyrinth itself, but they could still align their lives with the lunar wisdom that flowed from Knossos. Monthly gatherings timed to the full moon brought the community together, sharing in the light that connected earth to sky, mortal to divine. Stories about the moon's origin varied, but Cretan versions often featured the goddess who supposedly dwelled in the labyrinth, creating or claiming the moon as her eye, a way to watch over her people even when she remained hidden in the earth. This explained why moonlight could reveal hidden things and transform the labyrinth. The goddess was literally looking through the moon, her gaze penetrating shadows and illuminating truth. To walk in moonlight was to be seen by her, to have your soul examined by divine attention that missed nothing. Children born during full moons were considered specially blessed, marked by the goddess for important destinies. Families celebrated these births with particular enthusiasm, though they also understood that lunar blessing came with expectations. Moon children often became priests or entered other service to the divine, their lives dedicated to maintaining the relationship between heaven and earth that the moon represented. Some claimed these children could see things others missed, their connection to lunar energy giving them access to hidden knowledge. The practical applications of lunar knowledge extended into agriculture and fishing. Farmers planted according to moon phases, understanding that different crops thrived when seeded during specific lunar periods. Fishermen timed their voyages to coincide with favorable moons, knowing that certain fish moved with lunar tides in predictable patterns. This wasn't superstition but accumulated wisdom, generations of observation translated into working knowledge that increased yields and improved outcomes. Yet the moon also brought madness to some. Not everyone could handle its transformative power. People whose minds were already fragile might break completely during full moon periods, exhibiting behaviors that range from harmless eccentricity to dangerous violence. The palace maintained special quarters for those affected this way, rooms designed to protect both the afflicted and those around them during the dangerous lunar phases. Healers treated these conditions with lunar water and other remedies, sometimes successfully restoring balance, other times only managing symptoms until the moon phase passed. The vocabulary surrounding lunar phenomena was remarkably sophisticated. The Cretan language contained dozens of words for different qualities of moonlight, distinguishing between the silver light of a full moon, the copper glow of a moon near the horizon, the pale illumination of a crescent, and countless other variations. This linguistic precision reflected genuine observation and understanding. A culture that had spent centuries studying the moon and developing language adequate to describe what they saw. Modern astronomers examining the palace ruins have confirmed the precision of its lunar alignments. The ancient builders possessed knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered for thousands of years, understanding orbital mechanics and celestial movements with accuracy that seems impossible given their supposed technological limitations. This suggests either that ancient science was far more advanced than typically assumed, or that the builders accessed knowledge through non-rational means, receiving information directly from the divine forces they worshipped. The moon's reflection in the sea created another layer of mystical significance. Standing on the coast and watching moonlight dance on waves, ancient Cretans saw the connection between sky, earth, and water made visible. The moon touching the sea created a bridge between realms, a path one might theoretically walk from shore to sky if only you knew the proper steps. Some legends claimed certain initiates had learned this secret, ascending on moonbeams to walk among the stars before returning with wisdom impossible to obtain on Earth. The end of the Great Palace era didn't end lunar worship on Crete, but the relationship changed. Without the Labyrinth's active presence, without priests maintaining the complex knowledge systems, the moon became something simpler and less immediate in daily life. It remained important, still marked time and influenced tides, but the deep magical connection faded. Or perhaps it just went underground, preserved in secret traditions, passed through generations of families who remembered when the moon was more than a light in the sky, when it was a living presence that shaped reality itself. Visiting Knossos today, during a full moon if possible, you can still sense something of what the ancient builders achieved. Moonlight on those old stones creates effects that feel intentional, purposeful, as if the palace still remembers its original function and responds to lunar presence even after millennia of abandonment. Stand in the right spot at the right time, and you might experience a moment where the boundaries thin, where you glimpse the palace as it once was, filled with moonlight and meaning, a place where heaven and earth met and exchanged secrets under the watching eye of the goddess's moon. The architect's hands, Daedalus arrived in Crete with a reputation that preceded him like a storm cloud. He was already famous throughout the Greek world as a craftsman whose works blurred the line between human ingenuity and divine magic. His statues supposedly moved on their own, taking steps and turning their heads as if alive. His buildings incorporated mechanisms so clever that they seemed to operate by will rather than engineering. Kings and wealthy patrons competed for his services, offering fortunes for constructions that would demonstrate their power and sophistication. But Daedalus was fleeing Athens when he came to Knossos, running from a tragedy that would define the rest of his life. The details of his exile varied depending on who told the story, but the core remained consistent. Daedalus had taken his nephew Talos as an apprentice, a young man who showed not just promise but genius that might eventually surpass the master himself. This prospect troubled Daedalus more than he admitted. He had built his identity on being the greatest craftsman alive, and the thought of being eclipsed by someone younger filled him with an ugly mixture of pride and fear. During a visit to the Acropolis with no witnesses present, Talos fell from the heights and died. Daedalus claimed it was an accident, but whispers spread immediately that the master had pushed his apprentice, choosing murder over eventual obscurity. Whether guilty of murder or merely unlucky, Daedalus couldn't remain in Athens. The shadow of suspicion followed him everywhere, making continued work impossible. King Minos of Crete offered sanctuary, not out of compassion, but because he saw opportunity. The king needed something built, a project of unprecedented complexity and secrecy. He needed an architect whose reputation ensured success, but whose circumstances ensured loyalty and discretion. A man running from murder accusations couldn't afford to refuse or to fail. Daedalus accepted the commission and came to Crete, bringing his young son Icarus, beginning the work that would consume the rest of his life and define his legend forever. The project was the Labyrinth, a structure unlike anything attempted before in human history. King Minos wanted a prison that was also a temple, a sacred space that was also a death trap. The king's wife Pasiphae had given birth to the Minotaur, a creature that was half man and half bull, a living reminder of divine punishment for the king's arrogance. The creature couldn't be killed without offending the gods further, but it also couldn't be allowed to roam freely, endangering everyone. It needed to be contained in a way that acknowledged its sacred nature while preventing its escape. Daedalus began by studying the land beneath the palace, exploring natural caves and passages that already existed in the limestone bedrock. He spent months underground, mapping and measuring, understanding the bones of the earth before he imposed his own design upon them. His approach combined respect for what already existed with bold intervention where necessary. He would work with the natural caves, enhancing and connecting them, while adding constructed elements that would transform the whole into something that transcended both natural formation and human building. The architect's hands were his primary tools, more so than any hammer or chisel. Those who watched him work noted how he touched stone before cutting it, running his palms across surfaces as if reading text written in texture and temperature. He claimed he could feel the stone's nature through his hands, understanding which pieces wanted to be shaped and which should be left alone. This wasn't poetic metaphor, but practical methodology. Stone that was forced against its grain would eventually crack or crumble. Stone worked with its natural inclinations would last for millennia. His design incorporated principles that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human knowledge. The passages didn't follow obvious geometric patterns, but instead curved and branched according to rules that felt organic, as if the labyrinth was growing rather than being built. Corridors spiraled in ways that confused spatial reasoning, making it impossible to maintain directional sense. Staircases went up while somehow ending lower than they started. Rooms connected to themselves through impossible topology. Daedalus was building something that existed partially outside normal physical constraints, a structure that was as much mathematical concept as physical place. The hands that created this impossibility showed the strain. Daedalus developed calluses in strange places, not where ordinary labor would produce them, but in spots that suggested he was gripping tools in ways that shouldn't work. His fingers sometimes moved without conscious direction, sketching designs in the air that he would later transfer to plans without remembering the intermediate process. He began sleeping less, working through nights lit by oil lamps, his hands moving constantly, even when his mind was elsewhere. Workers who assisted in the construction reported unsettling experiences. Following Daedalus's plans precisely should have resulted in structural impossibilities. Walls that couldn't support themselves, passages that intersected in ways that violated basic geometry. Yet, when built according to his specifications, everything held together perfectly. Some workers claimed the architect wasn't designing the labyrinth so much as channeling it, that his hands were guided by something that already existed in another form. and he was simply making it manifest in stone and earth. The most skilled masons noticed subtle patterns in how Daedalus worked. He would sometimes modify his plans after touching particular stones, as if the materials themselves provided input into the design. A block that looked identical to all others might be rejected, while another was selected with absolute certainty. When asked to explain his choices, Daedalus couldn't always articulate his reasoning. He just knew, with a certainty that transcended analysis, which pieces belonged where. His hands possessed knowledge his conscious mind couldn't access. As the labyrinth grew deeper and more complex, changes appeared in the architect himself. His hands began to show marks that hadn't been there before, patterns of lines across his palms that resembled the maze he was creating. These weren't normal wear from labor, but something stranger, as if the labyrinth was writing itself onto his flesh. He tried to hide these marks, wearing gloves even in hot weather, but those who saw them understood that something profound was happening. The creation was marking its creator, claiming him in ways that went beyond professional obligation. The relationship between creator and creation became increasingly complex as work progressed. Daedalus discovered he could navigate the labyrinth instinctively, even in darkness, as if his body knew the way without needing to think about it. His hands would trail along walls, fingers finding invisible marks that guided him through passages that bewildered everyone else. This ability should have been reassuring, proof that he remained master of his creation. Instead, it disturbed him, suggesting the maze had become part of him in ways that weren't entirely under his control. King Minos observed the project's progress with satisfaction that gradually turned to concern. The labyrinth was becoming more than he had commissioned, more than anyone had imagined possible. It was magnificent, certainly, a wonder that would make Crete famous for eternity. But it was also dangerous in ways that extended beyond its intended function as a prison. The king began to wonder if Daedalus had built something too clever, a structure whose full capabilities exceeded his specifications and perhaps his control. The architect's hands had created something that had taken on independent existence. The workers who had helped build the labyrinth began to disappear. Some left Crete voluntarily, paid well for their service but happy to depart after months of disturbing work underground. Others vanished without explanation, last seen heading into the maze to complete final touches on distant sections. Daedalus claimed they must have gotten lost in passages that weren't yet complete, unfortunate accident in a complex construction site, but rumors spread that something else was taking them, that the labyrinth was hungry and had claimed its builders as first offerings before the Minotaur ever entered its corridors. The architect's hands trembled now. When he wasn't working, he found himself drawing labyrinthine patterns unconsciously, doodling on any available surface with whatever came to hand. His son Icarus watched with growing worry as his father seemed to fade into his creation, becoming more committed to the maze than to his own life or family. Daedalus barely slept, barely ate, spending every moment either working in the labyrinth or planning the next phase of construction. The project had consumed him utterly. When the labyrinth was finally complete, Daedalus walked its full extent one last time. His hands touched every major wall, feeling the stone that had transformed from raw material into something alive and aware. He felt pride in his achievement, but also deep unease. He had built what was asked of him and more. The maze would hold the Minotaur, would confuse and trap anyone who entered without proper guidance. But it would also do things he hadn't specifically designed, things that had emerged from the interaction of his plans with the existing caves, with the limestone's properties, with forces he couldn't name but had learned to sense through his hands. King Minos celebrated the completion with elaborate ceremonies, but he also made a decision that would shape the next phase of Daedalus's life. The architect knew too much. He understood the labyrinth's secrets, could guide others through its passages, could potentially reveal weaknesses in its design. For the maze to function as intended, its creator needed to be silenced. Rather than kill Daedalus, which would anger the gods who protected craftsmen, Minos imprisoned him. The architect would remain on Crete, confined to quarters in the palace, unable to leave or share what he knew. His hands would create no more wonders. The imprisonment drove Daedalus to desperation. His hands, so recently engaged in the most ambitious construction project in history, now had nothing to build, nothing to shape. The enforced idleness was torture worse than chains. He began to plot escape using the only materials available to him. He collected feathers dropped by the birds that flew past his window. He hoarded wax from the candles that lit his chambers, and he began to build again, but this time constructing something that would lift him away from Crete and its labyrinth forever. The wings he built were masterpieces of engineering, lightweight frames covered with feathers arranged to capture and manipulate air currents. His hands remembered everything they had learned, applying principles of structure and balance to create something that shouldn't work but did. He built 2 pairs, one for himself and one for Icarus. Freedom lay in flight, in using the same ingenuity that had dug into the earth to instead take to the sky. The hands that had created the world's most famous prison would now create the means of escape from it. The flight itself became legendary, taught to children as a lesson about hubris and the dangers of ignoring parental advice. Daedalus had warned Icarus to fly neither too high nor too low, to avoid both the sun's heat that would melt the wax and the sea's dampness that would weigh down the feathers. But Icarus, young and exhilarated by flight, soared higher and higher, ignoring his father's calls. The sun's heat did its work. The wax melted, the wings fell apart, and Icarus plummeted into the sea that now bears his name. Daedalus could only watch, his hands that had built so many impossible things unable to save his son. The architect landed in Sicily, broken by grief but alive. His hands had accomplished the escape, but the price had been everything that mattered. He continued working, building temples and palaces for his new patron, King Cocalus. But something had changed. The supreme confidence that had driven his earlier work was gone, replaced by caution and second guessing. He had learned that his hands could create wonders, but they could also destroy what he loved most. The knowledge tempered his genius with wisdom, but it also diminished the pure, creative force that had made him great. King Minos pursued Daedalus to Sicily, so obsessed with capturing the architect that he traveled far from Crete despite the dangers. Minos posed a challenge that only Daedalus could solve, a puzzle involving threading a spiral shell. Knowing that the architect's pride wouldn't let him resist demonstrating his cleverness. The trap worked. Daedalus solved the puzzle, revealing his presence. But King Cocalus, valuing his resident genius, had Minos murdered before he could reclaim his escaped prisoner. Daedalus was safe, but he had caused another death, however indirect. The hands that created were also hands that destroyed. The later years of Daedalus' life are less documented, stories fading as the man himself aged and his creative fire dimmed. He continued building, but nothing matched the labyrinth in ambition or impossibility. Perhaps he feared creating something else that would take on independent life, or perhaps he had simply exhausted the divine inspiration that had flowed through his hands during that period in Crete. His later works were technically perfect but lacked the strange quality that had made his earlier constructions seem alive. When Daedalus finally died, his hands were examined by those who prepared his body. The labyrinthine patterns that had appeared during the construction were still there, faded but visible, a permanent record of what those hands had accomplished. Some claimed the pattern still moved slightly, as if the labyrinth continued to exist within his flesh even after death. His hands were preserved and eventually placed in a temple dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craftsmanship, where they were displayed as relics of the greatest craftsman who ever lived. The story of Daedalus and his hands raises questions about the nature of creativity and the relationship between maker and made. Did his hands simply execute plans conceived in his mind, or did they possess knowledge independent of conscious thought? Did the labyrinth use Daedalus as much as he built it, finding in this particular craftsman a conduit through which it could manifest in physical form? The ancient Greeks who preserved these stories seemed to believe the latter, that true creation involved collaboration with forces beyond human control, that the greatest works came through artists who knew how to let their hands be guided by something larger than themselves. Modern archaeology has uncovered the actual palace of Knossos, revealing complex structures that, while not impossible, were sophisticated beyond what should have been achievable with Bronze Age technology. The builders showed understanding of engineering principles that wouldn't be formally described for thousands of years. Whether this reflects lost knowledge, exceptional genius, or something genuinely mysterious remains debated, but standing in those ruins, tracing the paths that ancient hands constructed, you can understand why the Greeks believed someone like Daedalus must have existed, someone whose hands could reach beyond ordinary human capability to create works that touch the divine. The threads of light. Ariadne stood in the palace workshop, watching her handmaiden spin thread under the morning light. The work appeared simple, rhythmic movements that transformed raw wool into usable yarn, but Ariadne saw deeper patterns. She noticed how light caught in the fibers, creating momentary gleams that seemed almost alive. She observed how individual threads twisted together to create stronger whole, how choosing different materials and techniques produced threads with distinct properties and purposes. This knowledge would save a life and define a legend. The princess of Knossos had grown up surrounded by stories of the Labyrinth beneath her home. She knew its history, understood its purpose as a prison for the Minotaur, her monstrous half-brother born from divine punishment. The maze was a fact of palace life, acknowledged but rarely discussed in polite company. Every year, Athens sent tribute, 14 young people, who would enter the labyrinth and never return, food for the creature that couldn't be killed but could be placated with regular offerings. This arrangement had continued for years, a dark stability that everyone had learned to accept. Then, Theseus arrived and everything changed. He came as one of the Athenian tributes, volunteering to be among those sent to die. But he arrived with different intentions. He meant to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. It was an impossible goal. Dozens had entered the labyrinth before him, many of them warriors and heroes far more experienced than this young prince from Athens. All had died, lost in the twisting passages or torn apart by the Minotaur's strength. What made Theseus think he could succeed where so many had failed? Ariadne watched him arrive at the palace, watched him present himself to her father with the other tributes. Something in his bearing caught her attention. He didn't seem resigned to death like most of the others. He carried himself with purpose, as if he was beginning a quest rather than walking to execution. Their eyes met across the throne room, and in that moment, something changed for both of them. She saw a possibility where logic suggested only despair. He saw an ally where he expected only enemies. The princess faced an impossible choice. Her loyalty should be to her father, to Crete, to the system that had maintained peace between the kingdoms despite the terrible cost. But she also possessed her own sense of justice and mercy. The tribute was cruel, a punishment that fell on innocent young people who had nothing to do with the original offense that triggered it. If Theseus could end it, should she help him despite the betrayal that would represent? She began to plan, thinking through what Theseus would need to succeed. Killing the Minotaur might be possible for a skilled warrior with good luck, though even that seemed unlikely given the creature's legendary strength. But killing the Minotaur wouldn't matter if Theseus couldn't find his way back out. The labyrinth had been designed specifically to prevent escape. Once inside, the passages seemed to shift and multiply, creating confusion that made retracing one's steps impossible. Dozens of explorers had tried to map the maze. All had failed, driven mad by its impossible geometry before they could complete their work. Ariadne understood the fundamental problem. The labyrinth defeated memory and reason. You couldn't navigate it by remembering your path because the paths changed depending on where you were standing and how long you'd been walking. You couldn't map it because the maps contradicted themselves when compared. The maze existed partially outside normal spatial rules, operating on principles that Daedalus had built into its very structure. To escape, you needed something that could transcend these limitations, something that remained constant even when everything else shifted. The solution came to her while watching the spinning again. Thread was constant. It didn't change based on perception or confusion. A thread unspooled from entrance to exit would create a physical connection that couldn't be confused by the labyrinth's tricks. It was simple, almost embarrassingly so, given how long the tribute had continued. Why hadn't anyone thought of this before? Perhaps because the solution seemed too simple for such an impossible problem. Or perhaps because you needed to understand both thread making and the labyrinth's nature to conceive of combining them. But not just any thread would work. Ordinary wool would break or tangle, especially over the distances involved. The labyrinth might extend for miles underground, requiring thread strong enough to maintain integrity over that entire length. It needed to be thin enough to carry easily, but tough enough to withstand stress. And ideally, it should be visible even in the darkness of the deeper passages where torches and oil lamps provided minimal illumination at best. Ariadne spent days working with her most skilled handmaidens, experimenting with different materials and techniques. She tried mixing silk with wool, adding metallic threads, treating fibers with various dyes and solutions. She tested each combination, pulling and stressing the thread to find its breaking point, examining how it behaved when wet or exposed to heat. The handmaidens watched with curiosity but asked no questions. Palace ladies often had peculiar projects. Their job was to assist, not to judge or inquire too deeply. The final thread combined linen for strength with silk for smoothness, treated with a solution that made it resistant to moisture, and infused with tiny particles of something reflective that made it catch light in darkness. When she finally held the finished product, Ariadne felt satisfaction mixed with fear. She had created something that could potentially save Theseus, but using it would make her a traitor to her father and her kingdom. The thread represented a choice she hadn't fully made yet, but was rapidly approaching. She arranged a secret meeting with Theseus the night before he was to enter the labyrinth. They met in a garden near the palace outskirts, surrounded by night-blooming flowers that provided both cover and excuse for her presence there. She brought the thread coiled carefully in a small box, its weight surprisingly light considering the fate it might alter. Theseus listened as she explained his odds without help, then showed him what she had made. The thread gleamed in the moonlight, almost luminescent, its worked fibers catching and reflecting the pale glow. Theseus understood immediately, his expression transforming from polite attention to real hope. This might actually work. With this, he could focus entirely on the Minotaur without worrying about finding his way back. The thread would be his guide, his certainty in a place designed to destroy all certainty. It was elegant, practical, and brilliant in its simplicity. Ariadne explained how to use it. Tie one end securely at the entrance, somewhere, fixed that couldn't move or come loose. Keep tension on the thread as you walk, letting it unspool gradually. Don't worry about conserving it. She had made more than enough length. The thread's coating made it slippery enough to slide over obstacles without catching or tangling. When you want to return, simply follow the thread back. Don't think about it. Don't try to remember the path, just hold the thread and walk. It will bring you out. She also warned him about the labyrinth's nature. It would try to confuse him, would show him things that weren't real, would make him doubt the thread's reliability. He must ignore these illusions and trust the physical reality of the thread in his hand. No matter how lost he felt, no matter how impossible return seemed, the thread remained constant. It connected him to the entrance, to safety, to her. As long as he held it, he could come back. Theseus asked why she was helping him, what she wanted in return. Ariadne surprised herself with her answer. She wanted to leave with him. She wanted to escape from Crete, from her father's court, from the shadow of the labyrinth and its monster. She wanted a life that wasn't defined by the maze beneath her feet. If he succeeded, if he killed the Minotaur and escaped, he had to take her with him. It was the price of the thread and the knowledge of how to use it. He agreed, perhaps understanding that she was gambling as much as he was. Perhaps not fully grasping what her help would cost her. The next morning, Theseus entered the labyrinth with the other tributes. He carried the thread concealed, tied around his waist beneath his clothing. At the entrance, while the guards were preoccupied with the other Athenians, he found a fixed point and secured the thread's end, a knot Ariadne had taught him that wouldn't slip or loosen regardless of stress. Then he descended, letting the thread unspool behind him, a lifeline connecting him to the world above. The journey into the labyrinth tested everything Theseus thought he understood about reality. The passages did shift, not physically but perceptually, the same corridor appearing different when viewed from different angles. He saw exit passages that disappeared when approached, heard voices calling from directions that proved empty when investigated. The labyrinth attempted to break his mind before the Minotaur broke his body, but through it all, he felt the thread in his hand, its slight weight and texture remaining constant when everything else became uncertain. Finding the Minotaur proved easier than expected. The creature wanted to be found, or perhaps the labyrinth guided intruders to its heart regardless of which paths they took. The chamber where it dwelled was vast, much larger than should fit within the palace's known dimensions, with walls that seemed to breathe and shift in the torchlight. The Minotaur itself was terrifying, larger than any bull and possessed of intelligence that showed in its two human eyes. It had been waiting, knowing someone new had entered its domain. The fight was brutal and brief. Theseus had trained for exactly this, and despite the creature's strength and ferocity, it had never fought an opponent who genuinely meant to kill it rather than simply survive as long as possible. The Minotaur had grown complacent, and that complacency cost it everything. Theseus's sword found vital spots. The creature fell, its blood spreading across the stone floor, its final expression mixing pain with what might have been relief. After years of imprisonment and forced violence, death might have been mercy. With the Minotaur dead, Theseus faced the Labyrinth's final challenge. The maze seemed to react to the creature's death, passages becoming even more confusing, as if the structure itself was angry at losing its captive. Dead ends appeared where the thread indicated open paths. The floor seemed to tilt, making walking difficult and directional sense impossible. But Theseus followed Ariadne's advice. He stopped thinking, stopped trying to understand or navigate. He simply held the thread and walked, trusting it completely. The thread brought him out. Hours of walking, perhaps days, time behaved strangely in the labyrinth's depths. But eventually the passage lightened, fresh air replaced the stale depths, and the entrance appeared ahead. The thread had remained constant throughout, its length unchanged despite the apparent distances traveled, its direction true despite every sense saying otherwise. It had done exactly what Ariadne promised, providing certainty in a place designed to destroy it. Theseus emerged to find the other Athenian tributes safe, having hidden near the entrance rather than venturing deep into the maze. Together, they fled to their ship, joined by Ariadne, who had been waiting with increasing desperation for any sign that her plan had worked. They sailed immediately, knowing pursuit would come as soon as the Minotaur's death was discovered, and Ariadne's role in the escape became clear. The thread that had saved Theseus's life had also severed Ariadne's ties to her homeland forever. The story's end became more complicated and sadder than its beginning. Theseus abandoned Ariadne on Naxos, some versions claiming he was ordered to by the gods, others suggesting simple cruelty or cowardice. Ariadne, who had given up everything to help him, was left alone on the island, her thread having guided another, but leaving her own path uncertain. The god Dionysus eventually found and married her, providing a happy ending of sorts, but the betrayal remained a central element of the legend. The thread itself supposedly survived, preserved as a sacred relic in Athens for generations. Visitors came to see the actual thread that had defeated the labyrinth, though cynics noted that the object displayed seemed to change over the years, possibly replaced multiple times as the original decayed. Whether any genuine material remained, or the displayed thread was entirely symbolic, it served its purpose. The story endured, the thread becoming a metaphor for any guide through chaos and confusion. Philosophers seized on the thread as a teaching tool. They discussed it in lectures about problem solving, about the value of simple solutions to complex problems, about the importance of having a guide when venturing into unknown territory. The thread represented reason maintaining itself against unreason, physical reality anchoring perception when senses became unreliable, the value of preparation before attempting dangerous tasks. It was a perfect symbol, concrete enough to be memorable while carrying enough metaphorical weight to support serious philosophical inquiry. Artists depicted the thread in countless works, usually showing Ariadne presenting it to Theseus in romantic scenes that emphasized their doomed love story more than the practical innovation she had provided. The thread became golden in these depictions, gleaming impossibly bright, sometimes even glowing with divine light. These artistic choices moved away from Ariadne's actual achievement, the careful work and material knowledge that had produced a functional solution, replacing it with mystical elements that made the story more dramatic but less real. Modern interpretations of the thread vary. Some see it as early technology defeating mythology, human cleverness overcoming supernatural challenges. Others view it as representing the guiding principles that help people navigate moral or intellectual challenges. Computer scientists borrowed the term for discussing algorithmic searches through complex decision trees. Psychologists used it as a metaphor for therapeutic processes that help patients find their way through traumatic memories. The simple image of a thread in a maze proved endlessly adaptable, finding new meanings in each generation. The actual technique Ariadne invented, Marking a path through an unknown space to enable safe return became standard practice in later exploration of caves, mines, and other dangerous spaces. Spelunkers still use variations of her method, leaving markers or actual lines to ensure they can retrace their steps. Mountain climbers employ similar techniques when navigating complex terrain. Search and rescue operations adopt the principle when entering collapsed buildings or other hazardous environments. The thread's logic translated perfectly from mythological maze to real-world applications. Yet something was lost when the thread became purely practical or purely symbolic. Ariadne's original creation had occupied a space between those extremes, a physical object that acknowledged both material properties and the psychological challenge of maintaining orientation in genuinely disorienting circumstances. She understood that the labyrinth's power came from its ability to break down mental models of space. The thread countered that by providing something external to rely on, removing the need for mental mapping that the maze would destroy anyway. The story also raised questions about whose achievement was really being celebrated. Theseus got his name attached to the victory, became the hero who killed the Minotaur and escaped the impossible maze. But Ariadne provided the critical innovation that made success possible. Without her thread, Theseus would have died in the labyrinth like everyone before him. His strength and courage ultimately irrelevant against a challenge that defeated navigation rather than combat. Her contribution was arguably more impressive than his, requiring creative problem solving rather than the martial skills he had trained in his entire life. This dynamic repeated throughout Greek mythology. Male heroes received credit for victories enabled by female insight, magic, or assistance. The pattern revealed cultural assumptions about whose contributions counted as truly heroic, who deserved fame and recognition. Ariadne's thread became famous, but primarily as the thing Theseus used rather than the thing Ariadne created. The distinction mattered, representing broader questions about how societies assign value and remember achievement. The threads of light that gave this section its title referred to multiple elements. There was the literal thread, possibly luminescent, that Ariadne created. There were also the threads of light that filtered into the labyrinth from the entrance, marking the boundary between surface world and underground maze. And metaphorically, there were threads of understanding, insights that connected seemingly disparate ideas into useful solutions. All of these meanings intertwined, creating a richer story than any single interpretation could capture alone. Standing at the site of ancient Knossos today, you can look down into excavated passages that might have been part of the legendary labyrinth. They are confusing enough, even after centuries of archaeological study and modern mapping. Imagining navigating them without lights, without maps, hunted by a hostile entity, makes Ariadne's solution seem even more brilliant. The thread was simple, but simplicity often requires more insight than complexity. Recognizing that a problem needs a straightforward answer rather than an elaborate one represents a kind of wisdom that gets overlooked in favor of flashier accomplishments. Into the labyrinth. The entrance to the labyrinth appeared deceptively simple, just a stone doorway leading down from beneath the palace complex. No elaborate decorations warned of the horrors within. No inscriptions threatened those who might enter. It was almost mundane, easily overlooked if you passed through certain palace corridors without knowing what lay behind that particular door. But the simplicity was misleading. What waited beyond that threshold existed outside normal human experience, a space where the usual rules of reality bent and sometimes broke completely. Those who were about to enter underwent rituals designed to prepare both body and spirit for what awaited. They bathed in water, collected during specific lunar phases, and scented with herbs whose smoke supposedly protected against malevolent influences. They dressed in simple garments, nothing elaborate that might catch on passages or restrict movement in tight spaces. They received blessings from priests who invoked every protective deity whose favor might matter in the depths. These rituals provided psychological preparation as much as spiritual protection, giving people time to accept what they were about to face. The first few steps down from the entrance seemed normal enough. Stone stairs descended at a gentle angle, well made and recently maintained. Torchlight from the upper palace illuminated this initial section, and fresh air circulated freely enough to breathe comfortably. Nothing in these first 100 paces suggested the impossibilities that waited deeper in. This was the trap, the labyrinth's first deception. It lulled entrants into thinking the maze was simply a complex underground structure, nothing more mysterious than any other cave system or building foundation. But then things changed. The descent continued far beyond where the palace foundation should end, the stairs going deeper than seemed possible given Knossos' known geography. The air shifted, becoming cooler and somehow thicker, as if you were walking into water rather than atmosphere. Sounds behaved strangely, echoing when there was nothing to echo from or arriving from directions that made no spatial sense. And the architecture began showing signs of something beyond normal construction. Walls that seemed to shift position when you looked away. Passages that changed width as you walked through them. The passages branched frequently, creating choices that would define everything that followed. Most branches looked identical, offering no clues about which direction might be more favorable. Later explorers tried various methods to mark which paths they had taken, leaving scratches on walls or piles of stones at intersections. But these markers disappeared or moved, sometimes appearing in places the explorer hadn't visited yet, as if the labyrinth was playing with them, demonstrating that normal wayfinding techniques wouldn't work in this space. Distance became meaningless inside the maze. You might walk for what felt like hours, covering miles of twisting passage, then somehow end up only feet from where you started despite never doubling back. Or the reverse, taking just a few steps that left you impossibly far from the entrance, cut off from any hope of return. The labyrinth compressed and expanded space according to rules that human minds couldn't grasp, creating a geography that was more psychological than physical. The walls themselves deserved careful attention. They weren't simply carved stone, but something more complex. Up close, you could see layers, different types of rock and construction technique intermixed in ways that suggested the labyrinth had been built over centuries or possibly existed across multiple time periods simultaneously. Some sections showed weathering that indicated exposure to water and air for thousands of years. Others looked freshly cut, still bearing tool marks from recent work. Yet all existed side by side, past and present collapsed into immediate experience. Inscriptions covered certain wall sections, writing in ancient Minoan script mixed with older symbols that predated any known language. Scholars who studied copies of these inscriptions found them frustrating. The same symbol might mean different things in different contexts, or a grammatical structure would start in one form and shift mid-sentence to follow completely different rules. Some researchers suggested the inscriptions weren't meant to be read in conventional ways but experienced, that the meaning emerged from the act of encountering them in the labyrinth rather than from the symbols themselves. The ceiling height varied wildly, sometimes so low that you had to crawl, other times so high that torchlight couldn't reach it, and you walked through vast chambers wondering how far up the stone extended. These chambers often contained pillars, natural stone columns that supported the weight of earth and palace above. The pillars showed signs of modification, carved with spiraling patterns that drew the eye upward into darkness. Some people claimed they could hear music emanating from these pillars, deep tones that resonated through the stone and into human bones, making listeners feel the sound as much as hear it. Water played an important role in the labyrinth's atmosphere. Underground streams flowed through certain sections, their sources and destinations mysterious. Sometimes these streams were visible, clear water running through carved channels. Other times you only heard them moving behind or beneath walls, their presence felt rather than seen. The water's sound added to the maze's disorienting effect, providing constant background noise that made directional hearing impossible. You couldn't tell if footsteps or voices came from ahead or behind when everything echoed against water sounds. The temperature fluctuated in ways that didn't correspond to depth or distance from the entrance. Some passages were uncomfortably cold, breath visible in the torchlight, surfaces slick with condensation. Others were warm, almost hot, with air that felt tropical despite being deep underground. These temperature changes seemed random, offering no pattern that might help with navigation. You might walk from ice cold to oppressive heat in the space of a few steps, your body struggling to adjust to conditions that shouldn't exist in such close proximity. Light behaved strangely once you penetrated beyond the entrance area. Torches that should have burned steadily would flicker for no reason, sometimes dimming to almost nothing before suddenly flaring bright enough to leave after images. Shadows cast by these inconsistent flames would move independently of their sources, figures of darkness that seemed to watch or follow explorers through the maze. Whether these were optical illusions created by unstable lighting or something more intentional, something aware, remained unknown and frankly terrifying to consider. The deeper sections held surprises that defied explanation. Rooms that were clearly artificial, carved and finished to high standards, yet located in places that couldn't be accessed from the palace above. How had builders reached these spaces to work on them? Where did they enter and exit? The finished rooms suggested purpose and planning, but the isolation made that purpose mysterious. Some rooms contained furniture, stone benches, and tables perfectly preserved despite apparent ages of abandonment. Others held objects whose function was unclear, devices made from wood and metal and stone that might have been tools or art or religious implements. Occasionally, explorers found signs of previous visitors, a sandal left behind, a piece of torn clothing, sometimes more disturbing, things like bones or bloodstains that suggested violent endings. These discoveries drove home the reality that the labyrinth was dangerous, that many people had entered and never returned. The bones raised uncomfortable questions about the Minotaur. Were all these deaths caused by the monster, or did the maze itself kill people through confusion, accidents, starvation, or simple despair at being hopelessly lost? The emotional experience of the labyrinth was as challenging as the physical navigation. The combination of disorientation, isolation, and constant uncertainty wore down mental defenses. People began seeing things that probably weren't there, hearing voices of family members or friends calling from distant passages. The line between perception and hallucination blurred, making every experience questionable. Was that actually a safe path ahead, or was your desperate mind creating false hope? The maze attacked psychological stability as effectively as it prevented physical escape. Time distortion added another layer of difficulty. Hours might pass in what felt like minutes, or minutes could stretch into apparent days. People who entered intending to explore briefly found themselves stumbling out days later, confused about where the time went. Or they would return insisting only minutes had passed when guards confirmed they had been gone for days. This temporal instability made planning impossible. You couldn't ration food or water when you had no reliable sense of how long you'd been traveling or how long you might need supplies to last. The labyrinth contained spaces of unexpected beauty that contrasted sharply with the overall atmosphere of menace. Natural crystal formations filled some chambers, catching torchlight and throwing rainbow patterns across walls and ceilings. Underground lakes with water so clear and still they perfectly reflected whatever light reached them, creating illusions of infinite depth. Gardens of phosphorescent fungi that glowed in darkness, providing natural illumination in shades of blue and green that seemed almost magical. These beautiful spaces were arguably more dangerous than the obviously threatening ones, tempting explorers to linger when movement was survival. Sound carried through the labyrinth in unpredictable ways. A conversation at normal volume might be audible passages away, while a shout might die immediately without echo. This acoustic inconsistency meant you couldn't rely on sound to locate others or to understand how far voices had traveled. The effect isolated people even when they were traveling in groups. You might hear companions speaking, but be unable to pinpoint their location, creating the disturbing sensation of being simultaneously accompanied and alone. The maze contained deliberate obstacles in addition to its natural confusion. Doors appeared that could only be opened by solving puzzles, arrangements of symbols or objects that had to be manipulated in specific sequences. Bridges spanned chasms, some solid and safe, others rotten or trapped to collapse under weight. Rooms where the only exit required climbing through openings near the ceiling or squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for human bodies. These challenges suggested intelligence behind the labyrinth's design, intentional tests for anyone who ventured into its depths. Dead ends were common, but not all were truly terminal. Some apparent dead ends could be passed through if you knew secrets that weren't visually obvious. A seemingly solid wall might swing open with the right push. A floor might contain a trapdoor leading to passages below. The maze rewarded those who questioned their perceptions and experimented with their surroundings, but it also punished the careless or unlucky. Not every secret passage was safe, and some led to dangers worse than simple dead ends. The deepest sections, the heart of the labyrinth where the Minotaur supposedly dwelt, were rarely reached and rarely described by those who returned. The few accounts that existed were contradictory, suggesting either unreliable witnesses or the possibility that the center of the maze changed depending on who approached it or when. Some described a vast chamber with a throne made from human bones and weapons taken from defeated challengers. Others spoke of a simple cave, almost natural looking, with a stream running through it and signs of habitation, but no creature present. The inconsistency frustrated scholars trying to understand the labyrinth's true nature and purpose. What unified all accounts was the sense that the labyrinth was aware, not alive in any biological sense, but conscious in a way that suggested purpose and intention. It noticed who entered, responded to their presence, adjusted its configuration to challenge or test them specifically. This awareness manifested in small ways that might have been coincidence but accumulated into patterns that suggested genuine intelligence. The maze knew you were there and it had opinions about your presence. The psychological aftermath of labyrinth exploration affected people for years or even life. Those who successfully escaped carried memories that didn't quite fit together properly, experiences that made less sense in retrospect than they had seemed at the time. They struggled to explain what they had encountered, their descriptions sounding like dream narratives rather than coherent accounts of physical spaces. Some developed phobias of enclosed spaces or underground areas. Others became obsessed with mazes and puzzles, as if trying to solve through intellectual exercise what they had experienced as existential challenge. The labyrinth ultimately represented a threshold, a boundary between the ordered world of palace and city above and something far older and stranger below. Walking into it meant accepting fundamental uncertainty about reality and your place within it. The maze stripped away the comfortable assumptions that let people function in normal life, exposing them to possibilities most preferred to deny. This made it dangerous, but also potentially transformative. Those who entered and emerged might be physically unchanged, but their understanding of themselves and the world had been permanently altered by what they experienced in those impossible depths. The heart that sleeps below, deep beneath the labyrinth, below even the passages where the Minotaur roamed, something older waited. The Greeks who told stories about Knossos and its maze rarely mentioned this deeper mystery, perhaps because few knew about it or because the knowledge was deliberately suppressed. But fragmentary texts and whispered traditions suggested that the labyrinth served as more than a prison, that it was also a seal keeping something contained, something that predated the palace and possibly predated human civilization on Crete entirely. The stories called it the heart, though whether this was literal or metaphorical remained unclear from the surviving accounts. Some versions described it as a physical object, a stone or crystal that pulsed with internal light, generating a rhythm that matched the human heartbeat when you approached it. Other versions painted it as more abstract, a concentration of power or divine presence that manifested differently to each person who encountered it. What unified the accounts was the sense that the heart represented something fundamental, a source or center from which the labyrinth drew its strange properties. The heart supposedly predated the Great Palace, existing in those limestone caves long before Minos ruled, or Daedalus arrived to build his maze. The earliest inhabitants of Crete had found it, or perhaps it had called to them, drawing settlers to the island specifically because of its presence. These prehistoric people had worshipped the heart, built their first settlements positioned to honor or protect it, established traditions that would eventually evolve into the more sophisticated religious practices of later Minoan culture. But always, at the core, was the recognition that something powerful and sacred dwelt in the depths beneath their feet. When the palace was constructed, when the labyrinth was designed and dug, the builders incorporated the heart into their plans. The maze wasn't just a prison for the Minotaur, but a protective structure surrounding something that needed to remain isolated from ordinary human contact. The twisting passages, the disorienting architecture, the psychological challenges that defeated most explorers, all of these served as layers of defense preventing anyone from reaching the heart unless they possessed specific knowledge or received permission from forces that controlled access to the deepest chambers. Different religious traditions offered varying interpretations of what the heart actually was. Worshippers of the old goddess, the female deity whose cult dominated Crete before the Olympian gods gained prominence, claimed the heart was the goddess herself in her most concentrated form. She dwelt in the earth, and the heart was her physical presence, the point where divine essence touched material reality. Approaching it meant approaching divinity directly, without priests or rituals as intermediaries. Such contact could enlighten or destroy, depending on the supplicant's worthiness and intentions. Other traditions saw the heart as something darker, a prison rather than a sanctuary. They taught that something malevolent had been trapped there in ages past, bound by magic or divine power, and the labyrinth served to ensure it remained contained. The heart was its core, the concentration of its essence, kept in an induced sleep or stasis through mechanisms that ancient mages had established. The stories warned that disturbing the heart might awaken what slept, releasing something catastrophic that would threaten not just Crete but the entire world. A third interpretation viewed the heart as neither purely divine nor demonic, but something more neutral, a natural concentration of earth energy that ancient Cretans had learned to tap and utilize. The labyrinth channeled this energy, directing it to power whatever magical or technological systems the palace employed. This explanation appealed to those with more practical mindsets, viewing the myths as garbled accounts of sophisticated ancient engineering rather than supernatural phenomena. The heart was a power source, nothing more mystical than water turning a mill wheel, just operating on principles that later cultures forgot or never properly understood. Physical descriptions of the heart varied wildly, depending on the source. Some accounts described a chamber filled with light where a crystal formation pulsed with colors that cycled through the spectrum in mesmerizing patterns. The light supposedly contained sound, harmonics that resonated at frequencies that affected human consciousness, inducing visions or altered states. Standing in the heart's presence for too long risked losing yourself completely, your identity dissolving into the greater patterns that the light revealed. Other descriptions painted the heart as dark rather than light, a void that absorbed illumination rather than producing it. Torches brought into the chamber would dim and eventually gutter out, leaving absolute darkness that was somehow alive, aware, filled with presence despite the absence of anything visible. This darkness whispered, carrying voices from other times and places, allowing communication with the dead or with entities that existed outside normal space-time. The experience was profound and terrifying, offering knowledge at the cost of sanity and peace of mind. Still other accounts suggested the heart had no fixed form, that it appeared differently to each person who reached it, manifesting as whatever that individual most needed to see or most feared encountering. A warrior might find weapons of legendary power. A scholar might discover libraries of lost knowledge. A grieving parent might encounter the spirit of a dead child. The heart served as a mirror and a test, revealing the observer's true nature through what it showed them. This interpretation made it deeply personal, each encounter unique and non-transferable. The relationship between the heart and the Minotaur formed another layer of mystery. Trauco. Some versions of the story suggested the creature was placed in the labyrinth specifically to guard the heart, that its monstrous strength and immortal nature made it an ideal guardian for something that required eternal protection. The Minotaur wasn't simply a prisoner or a beast to be fed with tributes, but a purposeful element of a larger system designed to keep the heart safe from those who would misuse it. Other versions inverted this relationship, claiming the Minotaur was somehow created by or connected to the heart itself, that the creature's hybrid nature reflected the heart's ability to combine and transform different forms of life. Queen Pasiphae's unnatural desire for the bull might have been induced by the heart's influence, a deliberate action to create a guardian for itself using the royal family's bloodline to ensure loyalty to Knossos. This made the Minotaur not a punishment, but an intentional creation, tragic but necessary for a larger purpose. The few who claimed to have reached the heart and returned described the journey as a descent through layers of reality. The upper labyrinth tested physical courage and mental resilience. Deeper sections challenged spiritual purity and emotional honesty. The final approach to the heart required a kind of ego death, a willingness to surrender individual identity and merge with something vaster. Most people couldn't complete this process, turning back or losing themselves somewhere in the intermediate stages. Only those who could let go of self entirely would reach the heart's chamber and experience what it offered. Those who succeeded and returned were changed fundamentally. They carried knowledge that couldn't be fully expressed in words, understanding that operated at levels deeper than language. They spoke in paradoxes, claiming the heart was both empty and full, absent and present, ancient and newly born. Their descriptions frustrated those seeking concrete information but resonated with mystics and philosophers who understood that some truths exceeded rational categorization. The heart was real, but its reality was of a different order than ordinary physical existence. The heart supposedly possessed healing properties for those it chose to help. Sick people brought to its chamber would either recover completely or die immediately, the heart making instant judgments about whether life should continue or end. This binary outcome made the journey risky, but desperate families sometimes took that risk when conventional medicine failed. The stories suggest mixed results, with the heart's criteria for granting healing remaining mysterious and apparently arbitrary. Someone morally pure might die while a notorious criminal recovered, suggesting the heart used standards different from human concepts of justice or worthiness. Time behaved even more strangely near the heart than in the rest of the labyrinth. People who spent what felt like minutes in the heart's presence would emerge to find years had passed above, like visitors to fairyland in Celtic mythology, or the reverse, spending what seemed like days or weeks in contemplation only to find mere moments had elapsed in the world outside. This temporal distortion made the heart dangerous for anyone with responsibilities or relationships in the normal world. You might return to find everyone you knew dead of old age, or return only minutes after leaving, but carrying memories of experiences that spanned decades. The energy emanating from the heart influenced the entire labyrinth structure. The maze's impossible geometry, its spatial distortions and perceptual tricks all drew from the heart's presence. It was a source of power that warped reality in its vicinity, creating zones where normal physical laws became suggestions rather than absolute rules. The further you descended toward the heart, the stronger this effect became, until you reached depths where reality itself became fluid, responding to consciousness and belief as much as to objective facts. Ancient texts mentioned rituals designed to communicate with or influence the heart, complex ceremonies involving specific alignments of stars and moon phases, particular words spoken in precise sequences, offerings of substances that were carefully prepared according to secret formulas. These rituals supposedly allowed priests to request favors from the heart, asking for protection of the city, abundant harvest, victory in war, or other collective needs. Whether these ceremonies worked through appeasing an entity or through manipulating energy concentrations, the practitioners believed them effective and maintained the traditions for centuries. The heart's influence extended beyond Knossos in subtle ways. The entire island of Crete supposedly benefited from its presence, enjoying more favorable weather and protection from certain natural disasters that affected neighboring regions. Ships sailing near Crete experienced unusual luck, finding safe harbors during storms or encountering favorable winds when needed. This protective effect might have been coincidence or might represent genuine influence radiating from the heart through the earth and atmosphere, creating a zone of stability and prosperity centered on its location. Prophecy and the heart were intimately connected according to some traditions. The oracle priestesses who served Cretan temples received their visions by somehow connecting to the heart's consciousness, tapping into its awareness that existed outside normal time and space. This gave them genuine foreknowledge, the ability to see probable futures and warn of coming dangers. But the connection was dangerous, with many oracles going mad from prolonged exposure to the heart's influence, their minds unable to maintain coherent identity when constantly bombarded with information from past, present, and future simultaneously. The question of whether the heart was truly singular or represented something more distributed puzzled scholars. Perhaps the heart was just the most concentrated manifestation of something that existed throughout the earth. Nodes of power connected by underground channels forming a network that ancient peoples had learned to access. Knossos' heart might be one of many, possibly even connected to similar power centers in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other ancient civilizations. This network hypothesis explained similarities in mystical traditions across cultures and suggested that ancient peoples possessed a level of global awareness that orthodox history didn't acknowledge. Attempts to locate the heart using archaeological and geophysical methods have produced frustrating results. Ground-penetrating radar reveals anomalies in the limestone beneath Knossos, chambers and passages that don't match known construction patterns. But accessing these spaces is difficult, requiring extensive excavation that would damage the existing palace ruins. The few exploratory attempts that have been authorized found interesting geological formations in previously unknown chambers, but nothing matching the descriptions of the heart from ancient sources. Either the heart is deeper than modern equipment can effectively scan, or its nature is such that technological instruments can't detect it. The heart sleep, referenced in this section's title, suggests a state of dormancy rather than constant activity. Perhaps it awakens only under specific circumstances, responding to particular needs or threats. Most of the time, it simply exists, maintaining minimal presence while conserving its power. This would explain the varied experiences people report when attempting to reach it. If the heart is asleep when you arrive, you might find only an empty chamber, but if circumstances wake it, if your presence or purpose resonates with whatever consciousness it possesses, then you encounter the full phenomenon that so many stories describe. The relationship between sleep and dreams takes on special significance given the heart's supposed properties. If it sleeps, what does it dream? Perhaps the labyrinth itself is the heart's dream, a structure that exists because the heart imagines it into being. Everyone who walks those impossible passages is moving through the landscape of another being's unconscious mind, encountering symbols and scenarios that mean something to the dreamer but appear random or threatening to outsiders. This interpretation makes the maze less of a physical structure and more of a psychological space given temporary material form. Understanding the heart requires accepting multiple, contradictory truths simultaneously. It is ancient and eternal, existing before time and continuing after. It is local and universal, buried under Knossos but connected to everything. It is dangerous and beneficial, threatening and protective. These paradoxes don't indicate confused thinking, but rather point to something that exceeds the categories human minds use to organize reality. The heart is what it is, and all attempts to define or limit it inevitably fail because our concepts are too small to contain what it represents. The tradition maintains that the heart still sleeps beneath Knossos, that millennia of history happening on the surface haven't disturbed its rest. The palace fell, new civilizations rose and fell, but the heart continues its eternal dreaming beneath the ruins. Perhaps it waits for something specific, a particular moment or person that will wake it again, or perhaps its sleep is permanent, a stasis that will last until the island itself sinks beneath the waves or the sun expands to consume the earth. The stories don't specify when or if the heart will wake, only that it remains patient and powerful at the center of mysteries that humanity continues to circle without fully understanding. The goddess of the threads before Zeus and his Olympian pantheon dominated Greek religious thought. Before the patriarchal sky gods established their temples throughout the Mediterranean world, another kind of divinity held sway on Crete. She had many names, or perhaps she had no name at all, existing before language developed enough to capture her essence. Modern scholars call her various things like the Minoan mother goddess or the snake goddess, based on artifacts and images that survived the millennia, but to the ancient Cretans who worshipped her, she was simply the goddess, needing no other designation because no other deity mattered as much or held equivalent power. She was fundamentally connected to the earth, dwelling in its depths rather than the sky heights. Her temples were caves and underground chambers, spaces that descended into the planet's interior where her presence was strongest. The labyrinth beneath Knossos was her greatest temple, a structure that combined natural caves with human construction to create a space worthy of her worship. Every passage, every chamber, every confusing turn served not just to house the Minotaur but to honor the goddess who ruled the underworld of stone and shadow. The goddess was depicted in numerous figurines found throughout Crete, small statues showing a female figure with bare breasts, sometimes holding snakes, sometimes raising her arms in gestures that might be blessing or command. These images appeared in homes and shrines, suggesting widespread personal devotion rather than worship, limited to official temples and priestly hierarchies. She was accessible to everyone. Her presence felt in daily life, not distant and removed like gods who dwelt on mountaintops or in sky palaces. Her connection to snakes was particularly significant. These creatures bridged the worlds, able to move on the surface and below it, comfortable in darkness and light. The snake's ability to shed its skin made it a symbol of renewal and transformation, qualities the goddess embodied. She ruled over cycles, the endless patterns of birth, death, and rebirth that governed all existence. Life emerged from her depths, flourished for a time on the surface, then returned to her when death came. This wasn't a grim or morbid relationship, but natural, the goddess simply presiding over the inevitable progressions that characterize existence. The goddess of the threads earned this particular title through her association with weaving, spinning, and the interconnection of fate. Like the famous Greek fates who spun, measured, and cut the threads of human life, the Minoan goddess was understood to manipulate the threads that bound existence together. Every person, every action, every object existed as a thread in a vaster tapestry that she was constantly creating. The threads represented not just lives, but relationships, causes and effects, the countless connections that linked everything to everything else. This concept of divine weaving predated similar ideas in later Greek mythology, suggesting the Olympian fates inherited their characteristics from this older goddess figure. The image of three women controlling destiny by manipulating thread might have been a later elaboration of the goddess's single figure, a way of breaking down her complex nature into more manageable personifications. But originally, she was one, containing multitudes, handling all the threads herself in a process that was simultaneously creative art and administrative necessity. The labyrinth itself embodied this thread metaphor made physical. Its passages were threads laid out in stone, paths that twisted and connected in ways that mirrored the hidden connections between events and people in the world above. Walking the labyrinth meant experiencing directly the goddess's nature as weaver of reality. You were a thread moving through her tapestry, your path predetermined or random depending on your perspective and the choices you made at each intersection. The maze taught humility, demonstrating how individual threads were tiny elements in incomprehensibly complex patterns. Priestesses served the goddess in capacities that combined religious devotion with practical skills. They learned the sacred art of weaving, creating textiles that were not just clothing or decoration, but magical objects imbued with power through the process of their creation. Each thread used in these sacred weavings was prepared with prayer and ritual. Each pattern woven carried meaning, creating visual spells that could protect, heal, curse, or reveal depending on the priestess's intention and skill. These magical textiles were treasured possessions, worth more than gold because they carried the goddess's blessing woven directly into their fabric. The goddess's domain extended to mysteries of life and death that were explicitly female. Childbirth was her particular concern, women in labor calling on her for protection and successful delivery. The blood women shed monthly connected them to her cycles, marking them as participants in the eternal rhythms she embodied. Menstruating women were considered particularly powerful in ancient Crete, closer to the goddess during those days, capable of accessing divine insight that was less available at other times. This positive valuation of female biological processes contrasted sharply with later patriarchal religions that often treated such things as impure or shameful. She was also a goddess of wild places and untamed nature. Bulls featured prominently in her worship, these powerful animals representing strength and fertility that she channeled and controlled. The famous bull leaping ceremonies conducted at Knossos were religious rituals in her honor, acrobats dancing with danger to demonstrate human courage in the face of the goddess's wild power. The Minotaur, that hybrid creature of human and bull, might be understood as an embodiment of the goddess's ability to combine and transform, creating something new from existing elements, blurring boundaries that others considered fixed. The goddess's worship involved ecstatic practices, rituals designed to induce altered states of consciousness where devotees could experience direct communion with her. These might involve dancing to rhythmic music for hours, the repetitive movements and sounds breaking down normal awareness, or they might use sacred substances, plants with psychoactive properties that opened consciousness to perceive dimensions usually hidden from ordinary sight. In these heightened states, the goddess would appear or speak, delivering messages and visions that guided both individual practitioners and the community as a whole. Dreams were her language, the primary medium through which she communicated with humans. She sent visions in sleep, symbolic narratives that required interpretation but carried genuine wisdom about past, present, and future. Priestesses trained in dream interpretation served as mediators, helping others understand the messages they received during sleep. Important decisions were often made based on dreams. with leaders consulting dream interpreters before taking action on matters of war, trade, or governance. This made sleep sacred, a time when consciousness became permeable to divine influence, when the boundaries between worlds thinned enough for communication. The goddess's darker aspects were acknowledged without fear or denial. She presided over death as well as life, decay as well as growth. Bodies were returned to the earth, buried or placed in caves where they would decompose and literally return to her. This wasn't seen as tragic but natural, the completion of cycles that she oversaw. Death wasn't an ending but a transformation, consciousness returning to the goddess who had originally granted it, joining with her in ways that transcended individual identity. Some believers thought this union with the goddess after death was the ultimate reward, a state of bliss that exceeded any earthly experience. Her relationship with other deities was complex and not fully documented in surviving sources. Some evidence suggests she was considered the mother of other gods, having given birth to a divine son who might be understood as analogous to later figures like Dionysus. Other interpretations suggest she existed alone, without divine family or pure deities, simply the primordial power from which everything emerged and to which everything would return. The arrival of Indo-European sky gods during later periods forced syncretism, the goddess being married to Zeus or other Olympian figures in myths that tried to reconcile incompatible religious traditions. The palace at Knossos functioned as her house in the world of humans, a bridge point between surface reality and the deeper realms where she dwelt more completely. The elaborate architecture, the beautiful frescoes, the sophisticated sewage and water systems, all of this represented humanity's gift to her, creating a dwelling worthy of divine presence. Kings and queens ruled nominally, but they served ultimately as her representatives. Their authority derived from connection to her rather than from mere political or military power. A ruler who lost her favor would fall regardless of human support. Sacred objects associated with the goddess included the famous double-headed axe or Labyrinth that gave the labyrinth its name. This symmetrical blade represented her power to both create and destroy, to cut through what needed to be removed while preserving what had value. Priestesses wielded these ceremonial axes during rituals, the weight and balance of the weapons teaching them about the careful discrimination required when exercising power. The Labyrinth became a symbol of female authority and divine justice, a reminder that the goddess's rule, while often gentle, could be harsh when necessary. Offerings to the goddess reflected the values of the society that worshipped her. Agricultural products, first fruits of harvest, demonstrated gratitude for Earth's bounty. Crafted objects, particularly textiles and pottery, honored her as patron of skilled creation. Animal sacrifices occurred, usually bulls, their blood feeding the earth and by extension feeding her. These rituals were somber but not sorrowful. Participants understanding they were participating in necessary exchanges, giving back to the source so that abundance could continue flowing from her generosity. The relationship between the goddess and the Athenian tributes sent to the labyrinth deserves consideration. On one level, these sacrifices served practical purpose, feeding the Minotaur and maintaining peace between kingdoms. But deeper interpretation suggests they were offerings to the goddess herself. Young people in the prime of life returned to her depths. The horror modern minds feel at this practice might not have been shared by the ancients, who understood death differently and saw such sacrifices as honorable ways to serve both their community and the divine powers that sustained existence. When Theseus killed the Minotaur, he struck not just at a monster, but at a sacred creature under the goddess's protection. His success and escape could be interpreted as either his worthiness being recognized by the goddess who allowed him to pass, or as a violation that contributed to Crete's eventual downfall. The collapse of Minoan civilization following the Mycenaean period might be understood through religious lens as the goddess withdrawing her favor, abandoning a people who had failed to maintain proper reverence for her mysteries. The goddess's worship didn't entirely disappear with the end of Minoan culture. Elements survived, transformed, and incorporated into later Greek religion. Mystery cults, particularly those associated with Demeter and Persephone, carried forward ideas about earth goddesses, descent into the underworld, and cyclic renewal that originally belonged to the Minoan tradition. Orphic mysteries with their focus on death and rebirth. Dionysian ecstatic practices and the continued importance of oracles and prophetic dreams all preserve fragments of the older worship. Modern paganism and goddess spirituality movements have reclaimed the Minoan goddess as an important figure, someone representing female divinity and earth-centered spirituality that predated patriarchal religious systems. While these contemporary reconstructions might not accurately represent ancient beliefs, they respond to genuine hunger for religious imagery and theology that honors female experience and natural cycles. The goddess of the thread speaks to people seeking alternatives to sky god monotheism, offering a vision of divinity that is immanent rather than transcendent, accessible rather than distant. Archaeological work continues revealing new aspects of her worship. Recent excavations have found shrines and sacred caves that show continuous use, spanning centuries, suggesting the goddess's importance remained constant even as political situations changed. Analysis of frescoes and artifacts using modern techniques reveals details previous generations missed, providing new understanding of ritual practices and theological concepts. Each discovery adds threads to our reconstruction of this ancient religious system, though large gaps remain and will likely never be filled completely. The threads themselves serve as perfect metaphor for the goddess's nature. They are strong but flexible, able to bend without breaking. They can be woven into countless patterns, creating new forms while maintaining their essential nature. They connect disparate points, binding them into unified wholes, and they can be cut, severing connections when necessary, allowing worn-out patterns to be dismantled so new ones can emerge. The goddess worked with threads of life and fate, consciousness and matter, time and space, weaving reality itself according to patterns only she fully comprehended. Understanding her requires thinking in terms of wholeness rather than division. She wasn't good or evil, creative or destructive, but both and neither. She existed before such binary categories were imposed on reality, her nature too vast to be captured by simple oppositions. Approaching her meant accepting paradox, holding contradictory truths simultaneously. Recognizing that the framework humans use to organize experience might be inadequate for encountering the truly divine. The goddess of the threads remains ultimately mysterious, knowable through experience but never through explanation, felt rather than understood, honored through practice rather than doctrine. Her presence lingers in Crete even now, felt by sensitive visitors who report unusual experiences at archaeological sites. Whether this represents actual divine presence, psychic impressions left by millennia of worship, or simply the power of place and history to affect consciousness, something remains. The goddess sleeps, perhaps, like the heart in the labyrinth's depths, but she hasn't departed completely. Her threads still connect, still weave, still bind the world together in ways that science describes without explaining. And for those who seek her, who walk old paths with open hearts and minds, she might still occasionally reveal herself, offering glimpses of the ancient power that once shaped civilization and might yet have relevance for futures still being woven. The maze of memories. The labyrinth beneath Knossos was more than stone passages and architectural impossibilities. It functioned as a repository, a storage system for experiences and knowledge that transcended ordinary record-keeping. Every person who entered the maze left something of themselves behind, not just physical traces like dropped object or scratched walls, but memories and consciousness that somehow imprinted on the structure itself. The labyrinth remembered everyone who walked its passages, preserving their experiences in ways that later visitors could sometimes access. This phenomenon manifested in various forms, most commonly as visions or hallucinations that explorers experience while navigating the maze. You might turn a corner and suddenly see people who weren't physically present, figures from earlier eras wearing ancient dress and speaking in forgotten dialects. These weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, but more like recordings, moments captured and replayed by the labyrinth for reasons that seemed arbitrary or perhaps followed logic that human minds couldn't perceive. Watching these memory scenes was like viewing windows into past times, brief glimpses of lives that had intersected with the maze before. The visions weren't always visual. Sometimes they were purely emotional, sudden overwhelming feelings that belonged to someone else. Fear, triumph, grief, wonder. These emotions would wash over you without warning, so intense they felt like your own despite knowing they originated elsewhere. These emotional imprints suggested that feelings marked the labyrinth more strongly than mere physical presence. Moments of intense experience, whether positive or negative, burned themselves into the maze's substance, creating permanent records that subsequent visitors encountered as they passed through the same spaces. Sounds also replayed, voices echoing from empty passages, footsteps approaching from nowhere, music and singing that had no visible source. These auditory memories were particularly unsettling because they often seemed immediate and close, making listeners spin around expecting to find someone behind them. The acoustic properties of limestone caves contributed to this effect, sounds bouncing and distorting in ways that made localization difficult, but the consistency of specific sounds heard in specific locations suggested something beyond mere acoustics, actual preservation of past events in audible form. The relationship between memory and the labyrinth's physical structure was intimate and strange. The maze seemed to organize memories spatially, grouping similar experiences together in particular areas. Sections associated with death collected the memories of those who had died there, creating zones of overwhelming grief and finality that affected anyone passing through. Other areas held memories of triumph and joy, places where people had solved puzzles or found their way through difficult passages. These success emotions creating lighter atmospheres. The labyrinth had emotional geography, a map of feelings that existed alongside and sometimes replaced the physical map. Personal memories became unreliable inside the maze. Explorers found themselves remembering events they hadn't experienced, childhood moments that belonged to strangers, knowledge of skills they'd never learned. The boundary between personal and collective memory dissolved, the labyrinth offering access to a shared pool of experience that everyone contributed to and could potentially draw from. This collective memory functioned as a kind of distributed consciousness, the labyrinth serving as neural network for storing and retrieving information about thousands of lives spanning centuries. The phenomenon raised questions about the nature of consciousness and identity. If your memories could be accessed by others walking the same passages years or centuries later, did some part of you persist in the labyrinth after death? Were the visions people saw actually remnants of the original people, consciousness somehow trapped or preserved in stone? Or were they simply information, no more alive than words written on pages, data that could be retrieved but lacked any genuine awareness? The distinction mattered philosophically, but made little practical difference to those experiencing the phenomenon. Certain memories appeared stronger than others, replaying more frequently or affecting visitors more intensely. Traumatic experiences seemed to imprint most strongly, moments of absolute terror or pain burning themselves into the labyrinth so deeply they became nearly permanent fixtures. But profound joy also left strong marks. Ecstatic religious experiences or moments of transcendent understanding, creating positive imprints that offered unexpected comfort to later visitors. The strongest memories weren't necessarily the most important historically, but the most emotionally intense, moments where consciousness reached peak states that made deeper impressions on their surroundings. The labyrinth's memory function served practical purposes for those who understood how to use it. Priestesses trained in special techniques could deliberately access the memory stores, retrieving information about past events that would otherwise be lost. This made the maze a kind of library, an archive of Cretan history that bypassed the limitations of written records. You couldn't rely on it for precise facts and dates, but for understanding the emotional truth of events, the felt reality of historical moments, the labyrinth was unmatched. Walking its passages with the right mindset could teach more about the past than any manuscript, but accessing the labyrinth's memories came with risks. Some people became lost in the past, their consciousness merging too deeply with old memories until they couldn't distinguish personal experience from the experiences they were accessing. They would emerge from the maze confused about who they were, speaking in archaic language, claiming to remember events that occurred before they were born. Usually, this confusion cleared after some time on the surface, the present reasserting itself over the overwhelming past. But occasionally, someone would remain trapped in another era, their mind so saturated with labyrinth memories that their original personality was effectively erased. The Minotaur's relationship with the labyrinth's memory function was particularly significant. The creature had lived in the maze for years, possibly decades, depending on which version of the story you followed. During that time, it had accumulated memories at a rate far exceeding any human visitor. The Minotaur knew the labyrinth intimately, not just its physical layout, but its memory spaces, the emotional geography that layered over the stone passages. Some theorists suggested the Minotaur could deliberately access labyrinth memories, using them to learn about the people it hunted, understanding their fears and weaknesses through the emotional imprints they left while walking the passages. After Theseus killed the Minotaur, the creature's death became one of the strongest memories imprinted on the labyrinth. Visitors to the death chamber reported overwhelming experiences, the final moments of the Minotaur's life replaying with visceral intensity. They felt the creature's pain, its surprise that death was finally coming after so many years of imprisoned immortality. They experienced its last thoughts, whatever passed through that hybrid mind as consciousness faded. Some reported feeling relief alongside the pain, as if the Minotaur welcomed death as release from eternal exile in the maze's depths. The memories weren't static, but seemed to evolve over time, the same event remembered differently depending on when you accessed it. A battle remembered vividly right after it occurred might become hazier decades later, details fading like normal human memory. But other memories grew stronger with age, as if being accessed repeatedly by different people reinforced them, collective attention making them more permanent than they would be if simply left undisturbed. The most famous events in the labyrinth's history became almost mythological in their preserved form, the repeated retellings and re-experiencing shaping them into narrative structures that serve storytelling purposes more than accurate preservation. Children seemed particularly sensitive to the labyrinth's memories, perhaps because their minds were more flexible and open to external influences. Young people brought into the maze often reported seeing things adults missed, accessing memory layers that older visitors' more rigid consciousness couldn't penetrate. This made children valuable as interpreters, though it also made them vulnerable to being overwhelmed by experiences their immature psyches couldn't properly process. Special protections and rituals developed to shield young people during visits to the labyrinth, limiting their exposure to memories that might prove traumatic. The labyrinth's memory function interacted strangely with its spatial distortions. Sometimes, accessing a particular memory would cause the passages to reconfigure, the maze reshaping itself to match the layout it had possessed when the memory was created. This temporal confusion created paradoxes where the physical space existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. You might walk through passages as they appeared in the present while seeing people and events from centuries past. Two realities occupying the same space without either canceling the other. Noting these moments of temporal overlap could last seconds or hours, the labyrinth slowly settling back into its current configuration as the memory state faded. Deliberate forgetting was difficult in the labyrinth. Things you wanted to forget. Shameful acts or traumatic events you preferred to leave behind. These memories would resurface with particular force. The maze had no judgment about what should be remembered versus forgotten, preserving everything with equal indifference. This made it dangerous for people carrying guilt or trauma, their worst memories returning in vivid detail that could trigger psychological collapse. Some entered the labyrinth seeking to confront and purge these difficult memories, a form of ancient therapy that either healed or destroyed depending on the individual's resilience. The phenomenon extended beyond the labyrinth proper into the palace foundations and even the surrounding area. The entire region around Knossos showed signs of memory retention, though less intensely than the maze itself. People sleeping in palace chambers reported vivid dreams of past events, visions that seemed to come from the building rather than their own subconscious. Walking certain paths near the palace might trigger sudden recollections that felt alien. Memory, flashes of people using the same routes thousands of years before. The labyrinth was just the most concentrated expression of a broader phenomenon that affected the entire sacred geography. Modern visitors to the Knossos ruins occasionally report unusual experiences that might be interpreted as accessing the site's memory stores. A feeling of presence in empty rooms, sudden emotional shifts when entering certain areas, visual impressions of the palace as it appeared in ancient times. Skeptics explain these as imagination and suggestion, people's expectations creating experiences they then interpret as supernatural, but those who have experienced the phenomena firsthand often insist something genuine occurred. that they accessed information they couldn't have known through normal means, that the site itself communicated across millennia. The question of why the labyrinth developed this memory function fascinated scholars ancient and modern. Was it intentional, something Daedalus built into the structure deliberately? Or did it emerge naturally from the combination of human activity and the unique properties of the limestone caves? Some theorize the presence of the heart in the deepest levels created a field that affected consciousness throughout the entire structure, making memory preservation a side effect of deeper forces at work. Others suggested collective human consciousness itself created the phenomenon, thousands of people's attention and emotional investment somehow charging the space with properties it wouldn't otherwise possess. The memories preserved weren't limited to human experiences. The labyrinth seemed to remember everything that occurred within its boundaries, including the Minotaur's private moments, the behavior of insects and animals that entered the passages, even geological events like minor earthquakes or water flows changing course. This suggested the preservation mechanism operated at a fundamental level below conscious thought, recording reality itself rather than requiring awareness to trigger the process. Everything that happened left traces, some stronger than others, but none entirely absent. Dreamlike logic governed how memories presented themselves. You might see an event from multiple angles simultaneously, perceive thoughts and feelings of multiple participants, experience temporal compression where hours of activity appeared in moments. The memories weren't constrained by normal perceptual limitations, offering perspectives that would be impossible in ordinary waking consciousness. This made interpreting them challenging, requiring training to translate the dream information into useful understanding. The interaction between personal memory and labyrinth memory created feedback loops. Your own memories would be influenced by the labyrinth's stored experiences, and your altered memories would then be added back into the communal store, creating ever-evolving hybrid recollections that belong neither to individuals nor the collective but existed in between. This made reconstructing objective historical truth nearly impossible, but it generated rich psychological and emotional understandings that exceeded what factual records could provide. The maze of memories ultimately represented humanity's relationship with past and present, the impossible task of truly separating who we are now from everything we've experienced and everything that occurred before we existed. The labyrinth externalized internal processes, making the usually invisible work of memory and consciousness into something tangible that could be explored and studied. Walking its passages meant confronting not just the physical challenge of navigation, but the psychological challenge of maintaining identity while surrounded by countless other lives, other stories, other ways of being that threatened to overwhelm individual selfhood with their weight and intensity. The lantern's return. Among the countless objects carried into the labyrinth over its long history, lanterns held special significance. They represented hope, the belief that light could penetrate darkness and guide travelers through confusion back to safety. Every expedition into the maze began with careful preparation of these crucial tools, selecting the best oil, positioning wicks for maximum illumination, ensuring handles and casings were solid enough to withstand hours of use. But more than their practical function, lanterns became symbols of the journey itself, physical representations of the human spirit refusing to surrender to fear and unknown. The lanterns taken into the labyrinth rarely returned. Most explorers who descended into the maze never emerged, their lights extinguished in the depths, their remains and belongings lost forever in passages that refused to yield their secrets. The recovered lanterns therefore became treasured objects, tangible proof that escape was possible, that the labyrinth's power wasn't absolute. Families who received back the lanterns of loved ones who successfully navigated the maze kept them as sacred relics, passing them through generations as symbols of courage and divine favor. One particular lantern achieved legendary status, its story preserving details that captured imagination across centuries. According to the accounts, this was the lantern Theseus carried during his descent to kill the Minotaur, the light that illuminated his path through the impossible passages and witnessed the death of the creature that had terrorized a generation. The lantern supposedly bore unusual characteristics, crafted from materials that shouldn't logically combine and possessing properties that exceeded normal illumination. Some versions claimed it was a gift from Athena, divine craftsmanship ensuring it would never fail at crucial moments. The lantern's construction featured copper worked so thin it was nearly transparent, allowing light to pass through walls as well as openings. The fuel it burned wasn't common oil, but something special, possibly whale oil mixed with substances that altered how the flame behaved. The light it produced reportedly had unusual color, not the warm yellow-orange of typical oil lamps, but something cooler, almost blue-white, that illuminated details invisible under normal lighting. This unusual spectrum revealed things the labyrinth normally concealed, marking safe paths and warning of dangers in ways that regular light couldn't accomplish. Carrying this lantern through the labyrinth's depths, Theseus experienced the maze differently than those who had entered before. The special light penetrated illusions that normally confused visitors, showing passages as they actually existed rather than as the maze wanted them to appear. Dead ends revealed hidden continuations. False paths showed their true nature before explorers invested time following them. The lantern gave Theseus advantages that combined with Ariadne's thread to make his success possible where so many others had failed. The moment of the Minotaur's death was forever linked to the lantern in storytelling traditions. Theseus supposedly set it down before the fight, positioning it to illuminate the combat space while keeping his hands free for weapons. The creature emerged from deeper darkness into the lantern's pool of light, its form becoming fully visible for perhaps the first time in years. The Minotaur had spent so long in absolute darkness that the sudden brilliance startled it, costing precious seconds of reaction, time that Theseus exploited ruthlessly. The lantern didn't kill the beast, but its light enabled the killing, making it as much a weapon as any sword. After the fight, covered in the Minotaur's blood, Theseus retrieved the lantern and began his return journey. The light guided him back through passages that seemed different now, as if the creature's death had fundamentally altered the labyrinth's nature. Sections that had required careful navigation on the descent became straightforward on the return. The maze apparently lost interest in preventing exit once its guardian was dead, or perhaps it respected Theseus's achievement enough to allow passage. Whatever the reason, the return journey progressed more easily than the entry, the lantern leading steadily toward the entrance and freedom beyond. The lantern emerged from the labyrinth changed by its experience. The metal showed patterns that hadn't been there before, markings that looked almost like writing in an unknown script. The flame it produced afterward supposedly behaved strangely, burning without consuming fuel, remaining lit for days or weeks beyond what physics should allow. These transformations suggested the labyrinth had marked the lantern just as it marked everything that entered its depths, that the object itself had gained properties through its journey that elevated it beyond ordinary status into something approaching the magical or divine. Theseus brought the lantern with him when he sailed from Crete, keeping it lit throughout the voyage as if the flame represented the success he was bringing home. The light supposedly protected the ship from storms, pirates, and other dangers that might have prevented the celebration of his victory. When they stopped at Naxos and Theseus abandoned Ariadne, the lantern was one of the few items he took when departing, suggesting he valued it more than the woman who had made his success possible. This detail, preserved in various accounts, added moral complexity to the hero's story, showing how even great achievements could be tarnished by subsequent poor choices. The lantern's eventual fate varied depending on which tradition you followed. Some versions claim Theseus dedicated it to Athena, placing it in her temple as an offering acknowledging that divine assistance had enabled his victory. Others said he kept it throughout his life, using it during subsequent adventures, the lantern's unusual properties proving useful in other dangerous situations. Still, other accounts suggested the lantern disappeared mysteriously, vanishing from Theseus's possession as if recalled by whatever powers had originally blessed it, returning to some divine armory where magical items waited between mortal uses. Regardless of its ultimate destination, the lantern's return from the labyrinth sparked a tradition that continued for generations. Before entering the maze, people would have special lanterns blessed by priests, sanctified through rituals meant to invoke divine protection and enhance the light's ability to reveal truth. These ceremonial lanterns became more elaborate over time, decorated with religious symbols and constructed according to specifications that supposedly replicated aspects of Theseus's famous light. Whether these preparations actually helped or simply provided psychological comfort, people continued the practice. believing that proper respect for the lantern's symbolic importance might increase survival chances. The lantern also inspired a whole category of philosophical and theological discussion about the nature of enlightenment and spiritual journey. Priests and philosophers used it as metaphor for consciousness, illuminating ignorance, reason, penetrating confusion, divine truth revealing itself to worthy seekers. The lantern represented any tool or technique that helped people navigate life's difficulties and uncertainties. The journey through the labyrinth became allegory for human existence itself. Darkness and confusion being the default state, while the lantern of wisdom or faith provided necessary guidance toward escape and transcendence. Artists depicted the lantern in countless works, usually emphasizing its supernatural brilliance in contrast to surrounding darkness. Painters showed Theseus holding it high, its light creating dramatic contrasts of shadow and illumination. Sculptors carved scenes of the hero emerging from the labyrinth's entrance, with the lantern leading the way. Poets described its light in elaborate metaphors, comparing it to stars, divine radiance, the sun itself brought underground to challenge the earth's eternal night. These artistic interpretations built layers of meaning onto what might have originally been a simple practical tool. The contrast between lanterns that returned and those that didn't created powerful emotional resonance. Families sending loved ones into the labyrinth would watch for the returning light, hoping to see that familiar glow emerging from the entrance that would indicate successful navigation and survival. The absence of that returning light, the realization that the lantern and its bearer were lost forever in the depths, represented a specific kind of grief. The loss wasn't just of a person, but of hope itself, the possibility of return extinguished as finally as the lantern's flame. Some traditions held that the lost lantern still burned somewhere in the labyrinth's deepest sections, eternal flames marking the spots where explorers had died or become permanently lost. These ghost lights supposedly could be seen by subsequent visitors, distant gleams in corridors that seemed to promise guidance but led only to further confusion. Whether these sightings represented actual preserved lanterns, phosphorescent fungi growing on old metal, or pure hallucination born of fear and disorientation, travelers continued reporting them throughout the labyrinth's active period. The lantern's symbolic importance extended beyond literal illumination into questions about knowledge and ignorance, revelation and concealment. The labyrinth represented all forms of confusion and uncertainty, not just physical, but intellectual, moral, spiritual. The lantern was whatever tool or gift helped navigate these confusions successfully. For some, this meant religious faith. For others, philosophical reasoning. For others, still, simple human courage and determination. The lantern could represent anything that enabled progress through difficulty toward desired goals. Modern explorations of ancient sites sometimes find fragments of old lanterns, metal and ceramic pieces that once held flames in darkness thousands of years past. These artifacts receive careful preservation and study, each one representing a human story that usually remains unknown. Who carried this lantern? How deep did they go? Did they return or die in the attempt? The objects themselves can't answer these questions, but they serve as tangible connections to individual lives and experiences that would otherwise be completely forgotten. Anonymous losses in the vast sweep of history. The psychological aspects of the lantern deserve consideration alongside its practical and symbolic dimensions. Carrying light into darkness provides more than visibility. It creates a moving bubble of familiarity and safety, a small zone of normality that travels with you through abnormal spaces. The flame represents life itself, its warmth and glow offering comfort that goes beyond mere practical benefit. Watching the flame, ensuring it stays lit, gives focus during otherwise overwhelming experiences. The lantern becomes companion and responsibility, something to care for that helps maintain sense of purpose and identity when everything else becomes confusing. The return of the lantern signified not just physical survival, but psychological survival as well. Emerging from the labyrinth with your light still burning meant you had maintained enough presence of mind to tend it throughout the journey, that the maze's attempts to break down your consciousness and will had failed. The returning lantern was proof that human resilience could outlast even the most sophisticated efforts to destroy it. Each successful return reinforced collective belief that the labyrinth, despite its power, wasn't invincible, that human beings possessed resources that could match and occasionally exceed the challenges the maze presented. Religious interpretations of the returning lantern emphasized divine favor and blessing. The fact that Theseus's lantern survived meant the gods approved his mission, that killing the Minotaur aligned with divine will rather than opposing it. The lantern served as visible proof of this approval, its enhanced properties demonstrating that supernatural assistance had been granted. For believers, this meant success in the Labyrinth wasn't just a matter of skill and luck, but required being on the right side of forces greater than human power. Proper devotion and moral worthiness mattered as much or more than physical capability. The lantern's journey created a complete narrative arc that storytellers found compelling. It began on the surface in light and normalcy, descended into darkness and challenge, witnessed both great violence and great courage, and returned transformed by the experience. This structure mirrored human life more generally, the journey from innocence through trials towards some form of wisdom or completion. The lantern represented the self, the core of identity that hopefully survives the transformative experiences that life presents, returning changed but still recognizably the same essential thing. Different lanterns returned from the Labyrinth throughout its history, each one carrying its own story and acquiring its own significance for the people involved. But Theseus's lantern remained the most famous, the archetypal example that all others were measured against. Its return marked the beginning of the end for the Labyrinth's power over Athens and Crete, the moment when human ingenuity and divine assistance combined to defeat a system that had seemed eternal and unbreakable. The light emerging from darkness became a founding myth, a story that taught important lessons while commemorating an achievement that defined a generation and influenced all that followed. The lantern ultimately represented hope itself, the belief that no darkness is absolute, that confusion can be navigated, that returns are possible even from situations that seem hopelessly lost. This message resonated across cultures and centuries, the specific details of Theseus and the Minotaur mattering less than the universal human experience of facing overwhelming challenges and somehow finding ways through them. Every person who overcame serious difficulties carried their own metaphorical lantern, their own light that guided and sustained them. The returning lantern was everyone's returning lantern, proof that perseverance and courage mattered, that the human spirit possessed resources adequate to the challenges existence presented. The dream beyond the walls. The labyrinth existed as physical structure, stone passages carved into limestone beneath the palace of Knossos. But it also existed in another form, a dream version that paralleled the waking maze while remaining fundamentally different. This dream labyrinth wasn't accessed by descending stairs from the palace, but by falling asleep in proximity to the structure, your consciousness drawn into the maze's psychic dimensions, while your body remained safely on the surface. Those who experienced both versions insisted they were equally real, equally dangerous, and in some ways the dream maze posed greater threats because the rules protecting physical existence didn't apply in the realm of pure consciousness. The dream labyrinth appeared differently to each person who entered it, the maze reshaping itself according to individual psyches and preoccupations. Where the physical labyrinth maintained at least nominal consistency from visit to visit, the dream version transformed constantly, reflecting not just the dreamer's conscious thoughts, but deeper material from their unconscious mind. Fears manifested as hostile entities, desires appeared as temptations pulling you from your path. Unresolved conflicts materialized as obstacles requiring confrontation before progress became possible. The dream maze was ultimately internal, a journey through your own mental and emotional landscape given external form. Entry into the dream labyrinth wasn't entirely voluntary. Those who slept near Knossos found themselves pulled into it whether they wanted that experience or not. The phenomenon intensified closer to the palace, and sleeping directly above the physical maze guaranteed entry into the dream version with certainty that approached inevitability. This made rest difficult for palace inhabitants, their nights regularly interrupted by exhausting journeys through psychic spaces that left them tired rather than refreshed by morning. Special protections and rituals developed to help people achieve dreamless sleep when needed, but these weren't always effective against the labyrinth's pull. The dream maze shared certain features with its physical counterpart. Both were confusing. Both created profound disorientation. Both seemed intentionally designed to challenge and transform those who entered. But the dream version operated on symbolic rather than literal levels. A door that needed opening might represent confronting a difficult truth. A passage that required crawling through tight spaces could symbolize accepting humility. A chamber filled with water might demand emotional courage to pass through. Navigation required interpreting symbols and understanding what the maze was asking you to do psychologically rather than physically. Monsters inhabited the dream labyrinth just as the Minotaur inhabited its physical version, but these creatures were personal demons, manifestations of internal conflicts and suppressed emotions given form that could interact and even attack. A person carrying guilt might encounter accusatory figures reciting their failures and moral lapses. Someone struggling with anger would face entities that provoked them, testing their self-control. The monsters weren't external threats, but aspects of self, and defeating them required internal work rather than physical combat. You couldn't kill these creatures with swords, only with self-understanding and acceptance. Time in the dream labyrinth bore no relationship to waking time. You might spend what felt like years navigating its passages, living entire lifetimes worth of experiences, only to wake moments after falling asleep, or the reverse, a brief dream journey corresponding to hours of physical sleep. This temporal distortion made the dream maze useful for certain purposes. Priests and mystics deliberately entered it seeking visions and knowledge that would take lifetimes to acquire through normal means. The compressed or expanded time allowed accelerated learning and transformation that physical existence couldn't match. The relationship between the physical and dream labyrinth was complex and not fully understood even by those who studied them most extensively. Some theorists believe they were actually the same structure viewed from different perspectives. Physical senses perceiving it as stone and space, while dream consciousness experienced it as pure symbol and meaning. Others insisted they were separate but connected, the physical maze somehow generating or anchoring the dream version, giving it stability and consistency it wouldn't otherwise possess. A third interpretation suggested the dream came first, that the physical labyrinth was an attempt to manifest in material form something that originally existed only in consciousness and vision. Navigation techniques that worked in the physical maze proved useless in the dream version. Ariadne's thread couldn't function in a space that wasn't physically continuous. Lanterns provided no light in darkness that was psychological rather than optical. Memory of your path failed when the path constantly reconfigured itself according to your changing emotional states. The dream labyrinth required different survival strategies, things like maintaining sense of core identity regardless of transformations around you, accepting difficult truths rather than fleeing from them, recognizing that apparent threats often represented parts of yourself requiring integration rather than external enemies to defeat. Some people became lost in the dream labyrinth permanently, their consciousness unable to find the exit back to waking reality. Their physical bodies would lie in apparent deep sleep, breathing and heart rate normal, but consciousness unreachable. Occasionally, these trapped dreamers would recover spontaneously after days or weeks, returning with stories of extraordinary journeys and transformations. More often, they remained caught indefinitely, requiring constant care to keep their abandoned bodies alive, while their awareness wandered deeper into psychic mazes from which return became increasingly unlikely. The boundary between individual dreams and the shared dream labyrinth wasn't absolute. Multiple people sleeping near Knossos might find themselves in the same dream space, encountering each other while navigating their separate journeys through the maze. These shared dreams created strange experiences where people would interact, have conversations, help or hinder each other, then wake to confirm that others remembered the same events. This suggested the dream labyrinth possessed some form of objective existence beyond individual subjectivity, a place that consciousness could genuinely travel to rather than simply generating from internal material. The dream beyond the walls, referenced in this section's title, pointed to possibilities that extended beyond even the labyrinth's already vast scope. Some dreamers reported finding exits from the maze that didn't lead back to waking consciousness but forward into other dream realms entirely. These spaces seemed to exist independently of the labyrinth, vast landscapes and cities and abstract dimensions that you could explore if you were willing to venture further from the anchor of physical reality. Most people avoided these exits, understanding that traveling too far into pure dream space made return increasingly difficult. But a few deliberately or accidentally, passed through into realms from which no certain path back existed. These beyond spaces contain knowledge and experiences unavailable in ordinary existence. You might encounter gods and spirits operating openly rather than through subtle influence. You might access the memories and experiences of people who lived thousands of years ago, their consciousness preserved in dream form after physical death. You might perceive reality from fundamentally different perspectives, experiencing existence as animals or plants or even stranger forms of awareness experienced it. The dream realms offered opportunities for growth and understanding that transcended human limitations, but they also risked dissolving the boundaries that maintained individual identity. Teachers and mystics who specialized in dream work established techniques for navigating these treacherous spaces safely. They taught practices for maintaining psychological anchors, aspects of identity that remained stable regardless of transformations occurring around or even within you. They provided maps, not of physical spaces, but of psychological states and symbolic landscapes that dream travelers would likely encounter. They warned about specific dangers, traps that caught unwary consciousness and held it until external intervention freed them, or they learned to free themselves through insight and acceptance. The goddess whose presence permeated the physical labyrinth was even more accessible in the dream version. Here she could communicate directly without the filters that limited contact in waking reality. Dream encounters with the goddess were transformative, offering wisdom and power that couldn't be transmitted through normal channels. But they also demanded surrender, a willingness to temporarily abandon your separate identity and merge with her consciousness. This merger wasn't permanent, but it changed you irreversibly, leaving traces of divine perspective that affected how you understood yourself and the world afterward. Animals featured prominently in Dream Labyrinth experiences, appearing as guides, teachers, or representations of instinctive wisdom that civilized consciousness often suppressed. Bull symbolism naturally dominated given the Minotaur's role in the physical maze, but other creatures also appeared. Snakes represented transformation and healing. Birds symbolized freedom and transcendence. Dogs offered loyalty and protection. Each animal carried layers of meaning that dream travelers learned to interpret, understanding the messages being offered through their appearance and behavior in the dream space. The Dream Labyrinth preserved history differently than the physical maze with its memory imprints. Here, past events remained alive and accessible, not as recordings, but as ongoing processes you could participate in. You might find yourself present at the labyrinth's construction, watching Daedalus work while understanding his thoughts and motivations from inside his consciousness. You could witness the Minotaur's death from the creature's perspective, experiencing its final moments with full emotional and sensory reality. The dream maze collapsed temporal boundaries, making all of its history simultaneously present and available to those who knew how to access specific moments. Prophecy and the Dream Labyrinth were intimately connected. The oracle priestesses who delivered predictions and warnings gained their insights through journeys into the dream maze, traveling to regions where future possibilities existed in potential form. They would observe these possible futures, noting which seemed most likely to manifest and which represented paths that could be avoided through proper action in the present. The accuracy of their prophecies depended on their skill at interpreting the symbolic language of these future visions and their wisdom in advising how to respond to what they had seen. The question of whether death ended Dream Labyrinth experiences generated much speculation, but no definitive answers. Some traditions taught that consciousness after physical death entered the dream maze permanently, that the afterlife was essentially an infinite journey through these psychic spaces. Others believed death offered complete escape, consciousness either dissolving entirely or progressing to destinations completely separate from the labyrinth and its associated realms. The truth remained experiential rather than theoretical, something you would discover only by dying, at which point you couldn't report back to confirm or deny the various hypotheses. The practice of lucid dreaming, maintaining awareness that you're dreaming while remaining in the dream state, proved particularly valuable for navigating the dream labyrinth. Lucid dreamers could exert more control over their experiences, shaping the maze to some degree rather than simply being shaped by it. They could will themselves to specific locations within the dream space, call forth particular teachers or guides, even construct protective barriers against hostile entities or overwhelming emotions. This level of control didn't make the dream maze safe, but it gave practitioners significant advantages over those who entered unconsciously and could only react to what appeared. The boundary between nightmare and dream labyrinth was thin and often crossed. The worst dreams, experiences of terror and helplessness that jolted people awake in cold sweat, often involved the labyrinth, whether consciously recognized or not. The maze represented every form of being lost, confused, threatened by something you couldn't quite see or understand. It was the nightmare at the heart of nightmares, the archetypal experience of danger and disorientation that all specific fears drew from. Recognizing this connection could help with nightmare work, allowing people to understand their frightening dreams as messages from deeper parts of themselves rather than random mental torture. Creative inspiration drew heavily from the dream labyrinth. Artists, poets, musicians, and craftspeople who slept near Knossos found their work influenced by visions encountered in dream form. The maze offered images and ideas that couldn't emerge from conscious thought alone, gifts from unconscious depths that enriched culture and pushed creative boundaries. Some of Crete's most celebrated art supposedly originated in dream labyrinth experiences, the artists serving as channels for bringing back treasures from psychic spaces and translating them into physical forms that others could appreciate. The healing potential of the dream labyrinth received less attention than its dangers, but was equally significant. Psychological wounds that wouldn't respond to conscious effort sometimes resolved through dream journeys that address root causes at levels where they actually existed. Trauma, grief, shame, and other difficult emotions could be processed and integrated through symbolic encounters in the dream maze, emerging afterward with reduced power to harm. This made the dream labyrinth a therapeutic tool for those with skill and courage to use it properly. The ultimate lesson of the dream beyond the walls was that consciousness wasn't confined to physical bodies or waking states. That awareness could travel to realms that existed independently of material reality. The labyrinth served as gateway and training ground, teaching people to navigate non-physical spaces while providing relatively safe environment for making mistakes and learning from them. Those who mastered dream labyrinth navigation gained abilities that served them in all aspects of life. Understanding that reality was far richer and stranger than ordinary perception suggested, that human consciousness possessed capabilities that most people never developed or even recognized as possible. The relationship between dreaming and waking, between the maze in sleep and the maze beneath the palace, between psychological journey and physical structure, all of these dualities ultimately dissolved in the deeper understanding that the labyrinth represented. It wasn't really about stone or dreams, but about consciousness encountering itself. Awareness exploring the infinite possibilities that existed within and beyond individual minds. The walls that seemed so solid were actually permeable, and the greatest dream was realizing that separation between different forms of existence was ultimately illusory, that everything connected in webs of meaning and relationship that the labyrinth made tangible for those willing to enter its mysteries fully.